Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, enjoy.
Chapter 1. Man, I will be fucked. Setting down my phone after finishing yet another chapter of self-insert fanfiction, I reached the inevitable, inescapable conclusion that I had just exclaimed aloud to the empty silence of my bedroom. After gorging myself on another 500,000 words of ASOIAF self-inserts, I had come to the terrifying realization that if I were ever dropped into the brutal, shit-stained meat grinder of Westeros, I would be utterly, completely fucked. The main problem with all these fuck-ass protagonists in online stories was that they possessed the magically convenient brain of a polymath Renaissance god. Within 2 chapters of waking up in a medieval castle, some 20-year-old economics major who had never worked a day of manual labor in his life was suddenly explaining crop rotation, building blast furnaces, and organizing standing armies. How in the 7 hells do you even reinvent the fucking printing press from memory without any prior knowledge of metallurgy or topography? I call bullshit. It made no sense that a normal, modern man would be able to survive, let alone conquer, a world as cold and bloody as the 7 kingdoms. Hell, I considered myself a bit of a history buff, but building advanced machinery from absolute scratch in a realm that lacked basic plumbing seemed impossible. What was even less believable was how these self-inserts waltzed onto a field of battle, surrounded by men getting their guts spilled onto the mud, without shitting their trousers in raw terror. Of course, if I were placed in their boots, I would be able to lead my troops into the slaughter without breaking a sweat and completely decimate my foes. But that was simply because I was built different. Trust me, bro, leading thousands of ironclad peasants into a victory would be the easiest task of my life. I was born for this kind of glorious, megalomaniacal business. Letting out a long, heavy sigh, I tumbled back onto my mattress, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. Was it a bit concerning that I was holding a full-blown debate with myself at 3 in the morning? Every great ruler in human history had his peculiar quirks. Mine was just a healthy dose of vocal self-aggrandizement. I was not a tyrant or a dictator yet. All good things required time and careful planning. I simply needed to bide my time and wait for the precise moment to strike. Please ignore the obvious fact that lying flat on my ass while muttering to the plaster walls was not actively helping me seize sovereign power over my nation. Either way, dictatorship was generally considered bad by political scientists, but that was only because the masses had never elected someone as enlightened as me. If I were made king, no one would suffer. Trust me on that one. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, and then me. I let out a dreamy sigh, closing my eyes as I envisioned my bronze statue standing tall in some magnificent capital square. Just wait a few more years, my fellow conquerors. Soon enough, I would be joining your legendary ranks in the halls of history. Everyone would remember my name with awe and terror. The famous 3 in the morning burst of motivation hit me like a charging warhorse. I clenched my fists and snatched my phone back off the nightstand. There was definitely a non-zero chance that some golden-eyed goddess would descend from the heavens, snatch my soul, and drag me into a realm that desperately required a strong, visionary ruler to protect the small folk from brutal warlords. I had to be thoroughly prepared if the cosmic dice happened to roll in my favor. My fingers flew across the glass screen, launching Google and navigating straight toward Wikipedia with feverish intensity. I needed to hoard every scrap of technical knowledge required to uplift a backwards medieval society and utterly crush my enemies. Hell yeah. The hours bled away into the dark as I scrolled through endless articles, dutifully transcribing critical technological processes into my notes app. I dove headfirst into the mechanics of metallurgy, studying the precise differences between a primitive bloomery and a true blast furnace, taking note of how charcoal, iron ore, and limestone had to be layered to lower the melting point of iron. I learned about crucible steel, the chemical composition of black powder using saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, and how to construct a proper water-powered trip hammer. For agriculture, I carefully outlined the 3-field crop rotation system, noting how planting legumes like peas and beans in the spring replenished nitrogen into the depleted soil, paired with the introduction of heavy iron moldboard plows to break through tough clay. For masonry and engineering, I researched the exact proportions for Roman pozzolanic concrete, combining slaked lime, volcanic ash, and seawater to create a mortar that set underwater and lasted for millennia. I even took down notes on basic sanitation, boiling water to prevent cholera, creating crude soap from lye extracted from wood ashes mixed with animal tallow, and the mechanics of a basic screw press for printing using lead, tin, and antimony alloys for movable type. After 2 solid hours of frantic academic labor, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment wash over me. The 3 in the morning motivation was definitely not going to fade by the time I woke up. Trust. The following days passed in a blur of hyperfixation. As it turned out, the random surge of late-night ambition had not abandoned me. Taking full advantage of my school holidays, I spent every waking hour studying ancient civil engineering, medieval logistics, and the granular details of grand strategy. It was abundantly clear from my endless playthroughs of Hearts of Iron IV and Crusader Kings 3 that I was destined to be the greatest military genius of my generation. Map painting was insanely easy. I constantly wondered why actual historical generals had made such catastrophic blunders when the solution was always as simple as encircling the enemy division and cutting off their supply lines. Real-life warfare was straightforward, and I refused to hear any arguments to the contrary. Taking breaks from my rigorous academic schedule, I sank dozens of hours into real-time strategy games. Playing grand strategy was fundamentally an educational activity, and I would not take no for an answer from anyone who dared criticize my screen time. Just like any other night, I eventually collapsed onto my bed, though a lingering doubt remained in the back of my mind regarding those flawless self-insert protagonists who managed to single-handedly industrialize a continent, build an empire, and charm a harem of high-born ladies without ever running into a single complication. Dear Dark Lord of the self-inserts, I prayed silently into the dark, please grant me these exact same powers of outrageous plot armor. My eyelids grew heavy, and within minutes, I drifted off into a deep, dreamless slumber. Being a newborn babe once again was not fun, especially when you possessed full, unadulterated consciousness. It was the single weirdest, most unsettling moment of my existence. I had fallen asleep in my comfortable bed, and it felt as though merely a second had passed before my awareness snapped back into reality. It reminded me of a strange moment in my childhood when I had slept for 10 straight hours, yet it felt as if I had merely blinked. This time, however, the sensation was entirely terrifying. I could not see anything, I could not feel my limbs, and I could not draw a breath. A suffocating pressure crushed me from all sides, squeezing my very soul until it felt as though I were plummeting down the track of a massive, dark roller coaster. Finally, my head burst into the cold air, and I drew a massive, desperate breath into my tiny lungs. Despite my absolute best efforts to remain dignified and composed, I immediately burst into a loud, pathetic wail. It took a full 5 seconds of shrieking before I managed to force my vocal cords into silence. How humiliating. The dumbass self-insert protagonists in stories never cried when they emerged from the womb. I would have to take this shameful secret to my grave so that no future chronicler would ever write down that the great conqueror had wailed like a wet calf the moment he entered the world. That was simply unacceptable. When I finally managed to pry my heavy eyelids open, the world made even less sense. Everything around me was a blurry, high-contrast, black and white smear of light and shadow. For a horrifying minute, I genuinely believed I had been reborn into some bleak circle of hell, because it certainly looked the part. Gradually, however, I made out the shadowy silhouette of a human face hovering directly above me. It was impossible to discern specific details through the soup of my underdeveloped vision, but I was reasonably certain the figure staring down at me was a woman. I could not help but wonder which universe I had been dragged into. Gods above, I silently prayed, please let me encounter some dim-witted, breathtakingly beautiful women who will instantly swoon for me despite my obvious flaws. Then again, who was I fooling? I had never had the patience for shrill, entitled women to begin with. If any high-born lady tried to play mind games with me in this life, I would shut her down instantly. It was not much, but I possessed a healthy amount of self-respect. The absolute bare minimum I could hope for was that I had not been spawned into some bizarre world I knew nothing about, or worse, reborn as the scrawny son of a starving serf. Please, gods, not a peasant. Being a peasant was the absolute worst-case scenario in any era of human history. If this happened to be a harsh medieval setting, the chances of me dying of bloody flux before my 5th birthday as the child of some piss-poor farmer were astronomically high. That was not even factoring in the reality that even noble infants had a habit of catching a chill and dropping dead before reaching puberty. I had never understood how self-insert characters in web novels managed to thrive as filthy peasants. Even with a magical system, the odds were heavily stacked toward dying in a mud hut. Before my racing thoughts could spiral any further, the overwhelming fatigue of infant biology asserted itself, and I tumbled back into unconsciousness. Being a baby was unequivocally, undeniably not fun. For the vast majority of my existence, I was either knocked out cold, soiling myself, or staring blankly at a dark stone wall, often all three simultaneously. None of those activities provided the slightest bit of entertainment. This whole experience sucked absolute ass. Time completely lost its meaning. I had no way of knowing how many hours, days, or weeks were slipping past, largely because I was perpetually trapped in a cycle of sleepy delirium and agonizing hunger. My senses were terribly muted, and my hearing was muffled as if I were submerged underwater. The only real indicator that time was actually moving forward was that my limbs were becoming slightly less floppy, my vision was slowly resolving into vague colors, and my hearing was improving. From what I could gather with my recovering senses, I was definitely trapped in some sort of medieval stronghold. There was not a single modern wire, electric bulb, or glass window in sight. Wet nurses and maids bustled about, bathed in the dim, smoky flickering of tallow candles. The absolute worst part of this primitive nightmare was the diaper situation, which was a grand term for what was actually happening. There were no diapers in this godforsaken world. Do you have any idea how maddening it becomes to be wrapped in a crude swatch of linen that quickly becomes soaked in your own waste? Fuck this shit. It was completely unfair. I was utterly distraught, yet not a single soul in this castle could comprehend my inner turmoil. It was the most miserable existence imaginable. I have no mouth, yet must scream, wait copyright restriction. Words failed to capture the pure, unadulterated agony of my day-to-day life. There was no joy, no spark of happiness, only the endless drafty chill of the chamber and the indignity of my physical helplessness. If things continued at this rate, I was going to go down in history as the first infant to suffer from clinical depression. At times, I desperately wished for a simple way to shut down my cognitive faculties and wake up 2 years down the line, when I would finally possess full motor function and complete bowel control. Sadly, my silent pleas fell upon deaf ears. God was dead, and I had killed him, or whatever nonsense philosophy came to mind while rotting from sheer boredom. To combat the soul-crushing monotony, I eventually fell back on my absolute ultimate weapon, going to sleep. I had never truly appreciated it in my previous life, but having endless hours to ponder existence brought me to a profound epiphany. The ability to sleep on command was essentially a localized form of time travel. Soiled my linen rags again. Whatever, I will just time travel past the cleanup, feeling a sharp wave of hunger while waiting for the wet nurse. Nah, I am going to time travel. Bored out of my skull staring at the ceiling rafters. You guessed it, I will sleep and wake up in the future. Never before had I held such deep, reverent gratitude for the human body's capacity to pass out. Weeks drifted past while I remained in my half-conscious, time-traveling state. Occasionally, I wondered how much longer my sanity could hold out before I completely lost my mind. Fortunately, my physical hardware finally decided to upgrade. My sight, hearing, and motor control improved enough that I could comfortably sit upright on my tiny rear end and stare at the stone walls for hours on end. The servant girls and wet nurses gave me extremely dubious looks whenever I sat there in silence, gazing blankly into the dark corners of the nursery, but I paid them no mind. I had never been one to care about the opinions of background NPCs anyway. With my upgraded ears, I began to decipher the language spoken by the women surrounding my crib. It was essentially a dialect of English, albeit heavily accented and filled with archaic phrasings, strange idioms, and formal cadence. Unfortunately, they rarely spoke directly to me, which was a massive blow to my ego. Most of the words I managed to piece together came from quiet, hushed conversations between two wet nurses who hovered near the hearth. Almost every time they began to gossip, they would wander out of my limited infant hearing range before I could catch anything juicy. However, I did manage to snag one crucial, life-changing detail: they referred to me as a prince. When I heard the plump nurse call me, "Little Prince," I nearly wept tears of genuine relief. My statistical odds of surviving to adulthood and conquering the known world had just skyrocketed. Soon, the lords of this realm would bow before the reborn equivalent of Alexander the Great. In lieu of playing with the carved wooden dragons and crude rattles scattered beside my crib, I spent my days engaged in my favorite pastime, sitting quietly and staring through the wooden bars of my playpen like a tiny, scheming lord. While I could theoretically have been trying to execute basic physical exercises to build muscle, it felt like an incredibly foolish idea. The chances of my soft, malleable infant bones snapping under stress were terrifyingly high. Or at least, that was my assumption. I had never bothered to study pediatric physiology during my 3 in the morning research sprees. As I lapsed back into gazing mindlessly at the dark granite wall, plotting nefarious strategies to conquer this medieval realm, I noticed a small figure approaching my crib. My eyes struggled slightly to maintain focus, but I clearly spotted a young child walking toward me, followed closely by a tall woman who appeared to be a maidservant. It was only when the child reached the edge of my wooden pen that I could properly examine his features. The kid looked strikingly beautiful, although sickly to look at, almost androgynous, with fair skin and long, flowing silver gold hair. An albino, I noted internally. He appeared to be roughly 3 or 4 years old, though I was terrible at judging ages. Perhaps he was somewhat malnourished, though that seemed unlikely given the absurd quantities of fresh milk I was consuming every single day. Was I inadvertently stealing his food supply? Who cared? I was clearly the more important historical figure here, so more milk for me. 3-year-old kids had no business drinking from a wet nurse anyway. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was consuming far more milk than a normal child my age required, but I ultimately brushed the thought aside. Let me be a fat, prosperous dictator baby in peace. The silver-haired boy flinched slightly under my intense, unblinking glare, which filled my heart with immense satisfaction. Yes, boy, tremble before your future sovereign. Despite his hesitation, the boy stepped closer, resting his small, pale hands against the wooden bars of the pen and peering down at me. His voice was soft, high-pitched, and filled with gentle affection as he spoke. "My little brother Maegor, I am your brother, Aenys." I froze in absolute, unadulterated shock. I was not shocked by the fact that I now knew who my brother was, nor was I even shocked by the sudden, terrifying realization that I had been reborn as Maegor, the Gentle Targaryen, the future second king of the Iron Throne, the son of Visenya, the rider of the Black Dread, and the brutal butcher of the fuck-ass Faith Militant. No, none of those realizations held a candle to the utter bewilderment that struck me a second later. As I sat there processing my destiny, the wet nurse stepped forward, lifted the silver-haired Ponce into her arms, pulled down her bodice, and began to nurse him right in front of my face. My brother was 5 years old. He was practically a grown man in medieval years. Why in the name of the seven was he still drinking milk straight from the teat? I stared in speechless horror. I was going to have to straighten his ass out. Chapter 2. Gu ga ga. I barked out with all the sovereign authority my tiny, four-month-old lungs could muster. Aenys, acting like the loyal servant and submissive elder brother he truly was, immediately scurried across the cold flagstones of the nursery to fetch my stuffed Balerian dragon toy. It was a crude, wool-stuffed thing with leather wings and tiny glass beads for eyes, but it was currently my most prized possession in this godforsaken stone castle. He offered it through the carved oak railings of my wooden playpen, bowing his pale silver head with a soft, gentle smile. I reached my chubby, dimpled infant hands through the bars, snatched the dragon from his grasp, and pulled it into my lair, placing it firmly beside my knee. Giving the future second king of Westeros a firm, solemn nod of approval, I immediately pivoted back to my primary daily assignment, staring at the wall. At this point in my endless captivity, I was 99% certain that I knew the exact number of stone bricks utilized in constructing this giant, brooding bedchamber. The grand total was an astounding, miraculous 0. That was right, the entire room, including the walls, the vaulted ceiling, and the cold floor beneath my padded blanket, appeared to have been carved out of a single, continuous slab of seamless, fused black stone. It was a masterpiece of old Valyria, shaped by dragonfire and blood sorcery before the doom ever touched the freehold. It was genuinely fascinating from an engineering standpoint. How had those dragonlords managed to mold solid rock like wet clay using primitive medieval technology? Well, at the end of the day, it was not really my concern, so I could not bring myself to care over much about ancient history. However, if I ever managed to uncover the exact secret of Valyrian stone masonry once I grew old enough to hold a quill, I would not hesitate to put it to use. Even if mastering the craft required me to sacrifice 1,000 small folk souls to some dark blood altar, who actually gave a damn about the peasantry anyway. They were all destined to die in a year or two regardless, shitting their guts out into a ditch from some easily curable medieval dysentery. 1,000 human sacrifices was my hard limit for now, mind you. I was not willing to sacrifice 1,001 souls for a fortress wall. That would simply be too cartoonishly evil, even for a visionary dictator in the making. Never go full retard. Oh shit, copyright strike again, my bad. Being a royal prince was unequivocally the absolute best life imaginable. Now, if only I were 15 years older, I could actually begin enjoying my elevated social status properly. What was the point of being a highborn dragonlord if you could not flirt with a few curvaceous serving wenches or tease the pretty handmaidens bringing wine to the hall? For the time being, trapped inside this tiny, helpless frame, all I could do was lie on my back and stare intensely at the attractive young women who cleaned my chamber and changed my wrappings every morning. A lion might lose its teeth in infancy, but it never lost its hunger for beauty. Now that I actually took the time to ponder the matter, it was profoundly strange how a majority of the handmaidens and serving girls in this dreary castle looked so damn good. What kind of medieval beauty products were they using in this era? Especially out here on a remote, wind-skirt volcanic rock like Dragonstone. Maybe dragon manure contained some secret, magical skin-cleansing chemical that wiped away blemishes and left their complexions smooth as Myrish glass. It honestly would not surprise me in the slightest, considering all the absurd, magical bullshit that occurred in this world on a daily basis anyway. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Aenys wandering back toward his cushioned stool near the hearth. He sat down, opened a heavy parchment tome, and began quietly reading like a soft-hearted, poetry-loving milksop of a prince. I let out a long, heavy sigh of deep disappointment. I had spent the last 3 weeks attempting to teach my elder brother how to execute proper push-ups to build his pectoral muscles, but my educational efforts had yielded 0 results. When I had tried to demonstrate proper push-up form by rolling onto my stomach and grunting while pushing my tiny baby chest off the blanket, he had simply giggled and clapped his hands, clearly treating my military calisthenics as a hilarious infant performance. Of course, swift and brutal vengeance had been delivered shortly thereafter. When Aenys had leaned down to scoop me out of the playpen for a hug, I had instantly reached out, grabbed 2 handfuls of his long, silky silver hair, and yanked with all the strength my tiny infant biceps could generate. Justice had been served swiftly in the nursery that day, and I was fairly certain Aenys would think twice before making fun of his future sovereign's physical fitness routine ever again. My wet nurse had chosen not to interfere during the hair-pulling incident, though she had let out a stifled chuckle at the spectacle. It had been obvious enough to her that I was not actively trying to scalp the heir to the throne. My eyes flickered over to the dark corner of the chamber where she stood silently, observing my every move. The moment she realized I was staring directly into her eyes with cold, unblinking intensity, she quickly averted her gaze, smoothing down the apron of her woolen dress and pretending to watch over Aenys instead. It was becoming increasingly obvious that I terrified the poor woman to a certain degree. While being feared and respected was generally a positive trait for a future king, it was distinctly dangerous if she began suspecting I was some kind of demonic changeling or demon spawn heathen sent from the seven hells to bring ruin upon House Targaryen. Being quietly smothered with a feather pillow by a superstitious servant was definitely not on my to-do list for this rebirth, so I needed to dial back the unblinking psychological warfare and pretend to be an ordinary, brainless baby as much as humanly possible. Perhaps sitting completely motionless and staring at a blank stone wall for 6 straight hours was not the smartest strategic decision in that regard. I could not bring myself to care too much about her suspicions right now. Staring at the wall was literally the only thing keeping my razor-sharp modern mind sane inside this mindless purgatory of infant existence. All my serious physical training, jaw exercises, and vocal articulation practice were strictly confined to the night hours. Even then, training was a nightmare because the wet nurse slept on a straw pallet right beside my wooden pen to ensure I did not choke on my own spitoop in the dark. Despite the constant surveillance, I had managed to make remarkable progress in mastering my vocal cords. I could already form basic consonant sounds when no one was listening. Unfortunately, the woman had caught me red-handed a few times in the dead of night, squirming frantically on my back while trying to do infant leg raises and tummy crunches under the blanket. From her perspective, watching a 4-month-old baby perform silent, aggressive calisthenics in the moonlight probably looked horrifyingly cursed. Aenys finally closed his leather-bound book, stood up from his stool, and walked directly toward the wet nurse, prompting another massive sigh to escape my lips. Even after spending an indefinite amount of time cooped up in this room with him, I had not been able to straighten his soft ass out completely. The boy was probably 5 years old, yet here he was, casually walking up to the wet nurse, lifting her linen bodice, and latching onto her breast for a mid-afternoon snack like a giant, silver-haired infant. It was an utter disgrace to the dragon blood. Alas, I would simply have to wait a few more months before implementing proper disciplinary measures. That grotesque display reminded me to analyze our current historical timeline. If my mental calculations were accurate, roughly 4 or 5 months had passed since my soul had been shoved into this tiny Targaryen vessel. Combining that estimate with the hushed gossip I had managed to overhear from the handmaidens and castle guards, my dear mother Visenya and my noble father Aegon the Conqueror were currently away in the deep south, actively burning the barren desert shithole known as Dorne into a pile of scorched glass. They had left both me and Aenys behind on Dragonstone under heavy guard, which was infinitely safer than keeping us at the mainland encampment. Wait, did the Red Keep even exist at this point in history? No, of course it did not. King's Landing was currently nothing more than a muddy, chaotic boomtown built around the crude timber walls of the Eggenfort atop the highest hill. The whole saga of the First Dornish War and the Dragon's Wrath was mind-bogglingly weird the more you analyzed it with a modern brain. No amount of primitive mountain guerrilla tactics should have realistically saved the Dornish lords from the combined, catastrophic firestorm of 2 adult, mountain-sized dragons like Balerion and Vhagar, especially when they burned every single source of food and water across the region. My honest assessment was that George R.R. Martin simply could not figure out a realistic, plausible way for Dorne to survive a total dragon genocide, so he slapped a massive plot armor blanket over Prince Corrin and the Martells and left it completely open without any proper explanation whatsoever. Of course, that logical inconsistency did not mean I was going to spare those sunbaked, wannabe Arabs when I eventually assumed command of the royal army in the future. I was going to burn those stubborn, desert-dwelling lords to the ground even harder than my parents were currently doing. The 7 kingdoms needed to be unified under one absolute ruler, and if the Dornish tried any of their poison and arrow bullshit with me, I would make them feel the blinding heat of 1,000 exploding suns. It was a universally acknowledged rule among military strategists that if you were losing a war against guerrilla fighters, it simply meant you were not trying hard enough. Just bring a bigger army and burn every blade of grass in sight until there was nowhere left to hide. Okay, that might sound a little sociopathic, but you will have to forgive my manic internal ramblings. If I remained trapped in this infant playpen for another 3 months without any intellectual stimulation, I was fairly certain my brain would completely short-circuit and turn into porridge. Regardless of the future bloodshed, one absolute truth remained clear to all: the whole world shall eventually witness the incredible benevolence and mercy of King Maegor the Kind, and definitely, absolutely not cruel. If a few hundred treasonous lords happened to get roasted alive along the way to peace and prosperity, well, that was entirely their own fault for standing in the path of progress. Letting out a massive, toothless yawn, I let my upper body collapse backward onto the padded blanket, staring up at the dark, fused stone ceiling now that I had run out of walls to count. I needed to keep a strict, cautious handle on my developmental milestones. It would raise massive red flags among the superstitious nobility if a 1-year-old infant suddenly began speaking in complete, grammatically flawless sentences. While I could not give less of a shit about what the medieval NPCs thought of my intellect, again, I had zero desire to get quietly strangled in my sleep by a fanatic septon or some religious zealot who believed I was a demon possessed by the stranger. Why did my soul have to be reborn into the useless, flabby body of a newborn anyway? Couldn't the cosmic gods of self-insertion have dropped me into Westeros as a handsome, sword-wielding teenager? There was literally nothing useful I could accomplish right now, nor anytime in the near future. I heavily doubted any lord on Dragonstone would be stupid enough to hand over silver coins to a preteen prince just because he spouted wild, incoherent ramblings about blast furnaces, crop rotation, and gunpowder. Sighing deeply in profound frustration, I wiggled my tiny, fat toes in the cool air. I grabbed my right foot with both hands, hauled my leg up toward my face, and enthusiastically began chewing on my own big toe like a savage. Yes, prime infant food snack. Judging by the sharp, burning ache in my lower gums and my sudden, uncontrollable urge to bite down hard on literally anything within arm's reach, my first set of baby teeth were finally starting to erupt out of my gums. That meant at least 4 or 5 months had passed since my rebirth into House Targaryen. Then again, I had never bothered to read a single textbook on infant physiological development back in my previous life, so I could be entirely wrong. I abruptly paused my mindless toehewing when I noticed the wed nurse suddenly snap to attention. She placed Aenys gently on the ground, smoothed down the front of her woolen dress with trembling hands, and bowed her head low toward the heavy oak door of the nursery. Curious, I turned my head sideways across the blanket, peering through the carved wooden bars of my playpen to see what had caused the servant to freeze in terror. Standing right at the entrance of the room in all her terrifying glory was none other than Queen Visenya Targaryen herself, her purple eyes locking directly onto me, who currently had a foot stuffed entirely into his mouth. Chapter 3. My royal mother's cold, violet eyes slid slowly across the chamber, landing upon my elder brother Aenys where he stood cowering in the corner. Under the sharp, unyielding weight of her glare, the 5-year-old prince seemed to shrink into the stone walls, lowering his pale head as if hoping the shadows might swallow him whole. Queen Visenya Targaryen stared at her nephew for a brief, heavy beat, her lips set in a thin, unforgiving line, before turning her gaze entirely away from him. She did not bother to acknowledge the wed nurse at all, treating the poor, trembling woman as though she were nothing more than a wooden stool or a patch of dust upon the floorboards. I let out a wet, raspy cough into my tiny fist, doing my absolute best to smooth out the agonizing awkwardness hanging in the room. While clearing my throat, I discreetly rubbed my saliva-drenched toes against the linen sheets beneath me to wipe off the lingering baby drool. Well, this was undeniably a rather bizarre, deeply ungraceful situation. It was hardly what any reasonable man would consider a stellar first impression upon his mother. Then again, this was not technically our first meeting, was it? The woman had already witnessed me entering the world in a shower of blood, sea salt, and infant shrieks inside the birthing chamber months ago. Besides, I was currently a fat, helpless four-month-old babe. No one had any right to judge my long-term leadership potential or my strategic genius based on my casual infant food-chewing habits. Still, a troubling thought crossed my mind. Was the biological hardware of a newborn infant actively leaching into my adult consciousness, making me act far more infantile than I cared to admit? That realization sent my mind tumbling down an existential rabbit hole of biological and metaphysical philosophy. Scientifically speaking, it should have been completely, physically impossible for an adult mind to function inside an infant's skull. A 4-month-old human brain lacked the developed neural pathways, myelinated axons, and structural capacity to hold 30 years of modern memories, complex English grammar, and grand strategy tactics from Crusader Kings 3. My head should have exploded from cognitive overload, or my consciousness should have been completely erased, leaving behind only the primitive instincts to suckle, cry, and sleep. So how in the 7 hells was I sitting here, evaluating my royal mother's fashion choices while maintaining my full identity? Was there some bizarre, cosmic bullshit going on regarding the human soul? Perhaps in a universe governed by blood sorcery, prophecy, and giant flying fire lizards, human memory and personality were stored within the immortal soul rather than physical brain tissue. Or, perhaps the infants in Westeros were simply built different from modern earthlings. After all, didn't Ned Stark once tell a 4-year-old Rickon that he would not stay young forever, right before the kid went off to run wild in the woods with a direwolf? Medieval children in these fantasy realms seemed to mature at a downright alarming speed anyway. My deep philosophical ramblings were abruptly shattered as Queen Visenya strolled across the chamber, her boots clicking against the flagstones, and leaned over the wooden railings of my playpen to scoop me up. Her hands felt remarkably hard and unyielding against my soft baby skin, largely because she was fully garbed in her dragon riding gear. She wore a coat of boiled black leather, reinforced at the shoulders and breast with dark steel scales that gleamed like wet obsidian. The sleeves and high collar were trimmed with heavy scarlet wool, fastened across her throat with a bronze clasp shaped into the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Her hands were encased in thick, iron-studded leather gauntlets that smelled strongly of saddle soap, dragon scales, horse sweat, and old chimney ash. The whole ensemble was strikingly stylish and intimidating, I must admit, especially with the dark gray and crimson accents woven into the leather dagging. Yet all that martial finery would have meant very little were it not for the breathtaking, terrifying beauty of the woman wearing it. As Visenya raised me up to her eye level, holding my small frame in her gloved hands to inspect me, I spent those quiet seconds analyzing her right back. Visenya Targaryen was a spectacularly, unbelievably stunning woman, and I do not mean that in some superficial, generic fantasy way. She was simply breathtaking, looking like an otherworldly entity that had descended from the stars. Her silver gold hair was pulled back tightly into a thick, elegant braid that hung down her back, revealing the sharp, ruthless contours of her face. She possessed high, prominent Valyrian cheekbones carved like fine marble, a straight, noble nose, perfectly set pink lips and eyes the dark, intense purple of polished amethysts. My mother was without a single shred of doubt the most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes upon in my 2 lifetimes. I could not help but notice that even her neatly arched eyebrows were the exact same shimmering silver gold color as her hair, lacking a single dark hair. How utterly bizarre. It made zero logical sense that a human being this drop-dead gorgeous could exist in a filthy, plague-ridden medieval world without modern skin cream, cosmetic surgery, or ring lights. The finest oil paintings from my previous life, crafted by masters trying to flatter wealthy nobles, did not look half as good as the raw, natural visage staring at me right now. What made the realization even more mind-boggling was the fact that according to historical accounts, Visenya was supposed to be the stern, less desirable sister compared to Rhaenys. If Visenya was this jaw-droppingly gorgeous, then how ridiculously beautiful had Rhaenys been before she got shot out of the sky over Dorne? To be entirely honest, I had always held a subtle preference for Rhaenys over Visenya back in my previous life. Mostly because Visenya was far more popular among the mainstream casual fans, and I held a petty, lifelong hatred for sharing popular opinions with the average populace. Satisfied with her swift physical inspection of my limbs and features, Visenya tucked me securely against her chest and turned on her heel, marching out of the nursery without uttering a single word to anyone in the room. I was more than a little creeped out by her utter stone-cold silence. A dark, paranoid thought crossed my mind, making me hope she was not carrying me off to some hidden subterranean vault to perform weird, blood magic Valyrian rituals to make my bones robust and fireproof. Please, dear mother, perform your dark sorcery experiments on the local peasant children instead. There were thousands of serfs scattered across the realm anyway, and the small folk could easily breed a fresh batch of infants within a year. Hell, my own biological mother had not even offered me a single, warm maternal smile since picking me up. There was definitely something deeply unsettling about this woman's parenting style. Yet, at the exact same time, I knew it would be exceptionally foolish to annoy her. It had been months since she had last seen me, given her military campaign in the south. Then again, surely no mother would willingly sacrifice her own infant son in some blood ritual, right? Right. Let us evaluate the situation from a strictly practical angle. If she was planning to perform some ancient dragonlord magic upon me, it was almost certainly intended for my own physical empowerment. Historical records proved that the original Maegor lived to adulthood, grew into a massive, unstoppable mountain of a man, and wielded Blackfire like a toy until he died on the Iron Throne decades later. In the end, I was never going to turn down a free stat boost. Give me a power-up, please. All that ultimately mattered in this brutal world was surviving to adulthood without getting stabbed in the back by a treacherous lord, poisoned by a maester, dying of dysentery, or succumbing to the hundreds of other gruesome medieval hazards waiting to kill me. Visenya stepped through the heavy oak doorway of the nursery, and 2 ironclad house guards standing post on either side immediately snapped to attention, falling into formation behind her boots as she traversed the wide, shadowy stone corridors of Dragonstone. I could not resist craning my neck to observe our surroundings as she carried me deeper into the fortress, the slight, rhythmic sway of her strides keeping me from drifting off to sleep. The main passageways of Dragonstone were utterly massive in both height and scale. The ancient Valyrian dragonlords had not constructed this fortress using traditional medieval masonry with carved granite blocks, wooden beams, and mortar. Instead, the entire interior of the castle felt as though it had been grown out of the earth or carved from the inside of a living, titan-sized beast. The walls of dark basalt and glassy black obsidian curved smoothly like the petrified ribcage of a leviathan, with thick, stony scales etched into the surfaces. Giant stone arches shaped like dragon ribs stretched high overhead, framing the vaulted ceilings in long, terrifying rows. Functional pillars and stone watchposts were carved into the likenesses of ancient Valyrian monsters, gargoyles with grinning, fanged faces, crouching sphinxes with cold stone eyes, and coiled manticores whose hollow, open jaws served as iron sconces holding roaring torches. The overall atmosphere of the castle was suffocatingly dark, gloomy, and bitterly cold. The jet-black obsidian walls seemed to actively absorb the pale sunlight that managed to seep through the high, lancet windows overlooking the fog-choked sea. The air smelled perpetually of old sea salt, damp stone, sulphurous soot, and burning tallow from the flickering wall torches. A normal, soft-hearted modern person spending extended time in a bleak, shadowy fortress like this would probably succumb to clinical depression within a fortnight. Not me, however. This place was the absolute, ultimate supervillain lair. Thank you, my ancient, incestuous Targaryen ancestors, for bestowing this glorious Blackstone estate upon me. I promised right then and there to utilize this magnificent fortress to its maximum potential. Once I grew old enough to rule, I would fully embrace my ancient Valyrian superiority complex, seizing absolute power, marrying my female sisters, nieces, mothers and whoever the fuck was included in this family circle to keep the bloodline pure, and mercilessly torturing any treasonous lords who dared oppose my sovereign will within these cold obsidian walls. I was 99% certain my conqueror ancestors would thoroughly approve of my glorious ambitions. Okay, maybe sleeping with my own biological mother was pushing the Valyrian blood purity thing a bit too far, even for a dragonlord. I might need to reevaluate the specifics of my incestuous harem plans down the road. But the grand goal remained unchanged. It was time to bring House Targaryen to unprecedented heights of absolute dominion. Which, historically speaking, was not saying much, considering the Targaryens were merely a minor, secondary noble house back in the Valyrian freehold before the Doom. But if there was one skill I excelled at above all else, it was role-playing an absolute tyrant. In roleplay I shall. Honestly, the sheer volume of chambers and side passages branching off these main corridors was utterly mind-boggling. There were dozens of arched doorways carved into every single wall, and I was fairly certain I had not even witnessed 1% of Dragonstone's true layout. I felt a surge of genuine excitement at the prospect of exploring these dark halls once I mastered the ability to walk. Perhaps one day I would stumble across a secret, forgotten passageway hidden behind an obsidian gargoyle that contained dusty spellbooks of Valyrian fire magic, or a forgotten chamber containing an ancient dragon egg. Yes, give me power. My wild fantasies were abruptly interrupted as my mother descended a sweeping flight of black stone stairs that led directly toward the outer courtyards of the fortress. It surprised me slightly just how long we had been moving, as Visenya had been marching at a brisk pace for 10 straight minutes just to reach the ground level. Just how ridiculously massive was this black rock castle? Unfortunately, I could not easily see over her shoulder because she was holding me awkwardly around my waist with one ironclad gauntlet, letting my legs dangle in midair. This woman genuinely did not possess a single shred of maternal instinct, did she? Who holds a 4-month-old infant like a sack of groceries? Visenya was carrying her newborn son more like a scruffy, wet alley cat than an imperial prince. Finally, after navigating through the windswept, rocky stone paths of the outer yard, Visenya brought her march to a sudden halt. I scratched my neck, suddenly feeling a wave of blistering, suffocatingly hot air wash across my bare baby face. Had my mother dragged me out to the edge of an active volcanic pit to toss my fat infant body into the magma like a sacrifice? I did not genuinely believe so. Visenya might be a cold, terrifying warrior queen, but she was still my biological mother, and she had spent months defending my claim to the throne. To test my volcano hypothesis, I strained my tiny neck around her leather sleeve, squinting against the harsh glare of the morning light to locate the source of the intense heat. Well, if I were any ordinary medieval infant, I would have instantly shitted my linen rags in raw, unadulterated terror. But of course, I was not an ordinary child. I was a reincarnated soul in the body of Maegor Targaryen, destined to be the mightiest, most terrifying ruler in all of Westeros. Looming directly above us, her massive, reptilian head lowered to within a few feet of the ground, was none other than the legendary dragon of my mother, Maegor. The dragon was a terrifying, colossal mountain of bronze and emerald scales that glinted wickedly under the cold morning sun. Her eyes were massive, glowing orbs of molten gold with dark, vertical slit pupils that locked directly onto my tiny, infant frame. Hot steam continuously hissed from her barrel-sized nostrils, carrying the suffocating stench of scorched meat, sulfur, and ancient ash that scorched the cold air between us. Rows of jagged, pale teeth, each as long and broad as a knight's broadsword, lined her massive, leather-lipped jaws. Visenya shifted her grip, raising me up in both gauntleted hands and presenting my tiny, dangling form directly to the face of the bronze beast. Maegor leaned her snout forward, drawing in a massive, rumbling breath that rustled my sparse silver hair, sniffing her rider's newborn child with deep, reptilian curiosity. I stared back into the gigantic, scaled snout hovering inches from my face. Every grand tale of legendary conquerors, god kings, and mythic heroes begins with a single, defining moment of absolute audacity. Something that instantly sets them apart from the mindless, pathetic plebeians who wander the earth without ever leaving a mark upon history. Here I was, experiencing my very first excursion outside my nursery walls, standing on the wind-skirted rocks of Dragonstone at 4 months of age. If I wanted to kick off my new life as a legendary dragonlord with an unforgettable, historical bang, this was the ultimate, golden opportunity handed to me on a silver platter. Therefore, like any completely rational, sane reincarnated person, I executed the only logical action available to me in that glorious moment. I wound up my tiny, fat baby fist, leaned forward, and slapped Maegor right across her massive bronze snout. Chapter 4. Being able to fly, an utterly surreal, mind-bending experience. Of course, it was not as though I had sprouted leather wings and launched myself into the stratosphere, nor had my mother tossed me off the battlements of Dragonstone for daring to disrespect her mount. It was the beast herself doing the flying, none other than Maegor the Bronze Menace. Or itself, considering the biological reality of Targaryen dragons, was an absolute mess of conflicting maester theories and Valyrian blood magic ambiguity. I was fairly certain Septon Barth had not been exactly right when he asserted that dragons were as changeable as flame, shifting their sex at whim. Then again, I was merely operating off half-remembered internet theories, forum debates, and my own gut instinct. Perhaps these giant fire lizards could indeed swap their genitals whenever the mood struck them, though I frankly did not care enough to go inspect Maegor's undercarriage to confirm the mechanics of dragon reproduction. Maegor, however, was a magnificent, terrifying sight to behold up close. She was simultaneously far larger and surprisingly smaller than I had anticipated based on my memories of television adaptations and fan art. She was considerably smaller than the mountain-sized beast I remembered from the House of the Dragon series, which made complete logical sense given that she was roughly 100 years younger at this point in the timeline, and dragons supposedly never ceased growing so long as they had open sky and endless cattle to gorge upon. Yet, even in her relative youth, my tiny, 4-month-old baby body was roughly the size of one of her golden green eye sockets. Which brought me to another fascinating dilemma of medieval biology: if dragons truly never stopped growing until the day they died, was there a physical tipping point where a beast grew so impossibly massive that its wings could no longer support its crushing weight? The square-cube law of physics seemed to dictate that at some point, the sheer metabolic energy required to lift a city-sized reptile into the clouds would outpace the amount of meat the dragon could physically digest in a day. I vaguely recalled reading obscure fragments of Valyrian lore back in my previous life regarding the freehold deploying truly gargantuan, ancient land dragons during their wars with the Giscari Empire. Massive, wingless beasts that functioned as living, biological siege tanks, hauled across the continent on massive iron chains to vomit streams of liquid dragonfire into enemy fortresses. I could not recall whether that particular snippet of lore was actual canon or just a fever dream from a 50-chapter self-insert fanfiction, but it sounded completely badass regardless. The icy sea wind whipped savagely across my bare face as Maegor beat her massive, leather wings, hauling her heavy bronze body upward at a steep, dizzying incline. The sheer force of the ascent pulled at my cheeks, stretching my soft baby skin backward like a jet pilot braving high altitudes. Fortunately for my frail infant neck, Visenya had constructed a surprisingly sturdy, makeshift harness out of soft velvet padding and boiled calfskin straps, securely binding my chest to the front of her steel-scaled breastplate like a medieval front-facing infant carrier. Visenya leaned her head down into the gale, her silver-gold braid whipping wild behind her, and opened her mouth to speak over the thunderous roaring of the wind. Gelinates, Nua Gevi, Audair Reinagan Isi Maria Tubis, Zakla Hen Vujatis, I am sorry, my beautiful one, you must endure but a moment more, above the clouds. Visenya's soft, melodic voice whistled toward my ears, almost entirely swallowed by the deafening rhythm of Maegor's wings carving through the sky. For a split second, I genuinely wondered if the rushing air had turned my infant hearing into complete mush, because the sounds coming out of her mouth sounded like complete gibberish to my modern ears. I could not help but scowl in frustration, leaning my heavy baby head back against her leather-armored chest and praying that the sickening turbulence would end before I vomited breast milk all over her royal Targaryen riding gear. A heartbeat later, Maegor crested the dark gray sea fog, leveling out her massive wings and gliding smoothly into the bright, blinding sunlight above the clouds. The bronze dragon let out a low, vibrating hum that rumbled straight through Visenya's saddle and into my spine as she assumed a stable cruising posture. Letting out a massive sigh of relief, I wriggled slightly against my leather harness, attempting to peer down over the edge of the saddle to see just how high into the heavens we had climbed. It proved to be an immensely difficult physical task, mostly due to my short, fat infant neck, my lack of upper body strength, and the sheer, absurd width of the dragon's scaled back. After a few seconds of frantic wriggling and squirming, Visenya noticed my struggle and gently cupped her gloved hand beneath my chin, shifting my position so I could look down past her stirrup. The view below us was nothing short of breathtaking. It was not entirely mind-blowing in the sense of absolute novelty, given that I had flown on commercial airliners dozens of times in my past life, staring out tiny double-paned glass windows while eating stale pretzels. But experiencing flight on the back of a living, breathing predator was an entirely different beast altogether. Far below us, the dark, icy waves of the narrow sea lapped gently against the jagged black cliffs of Dragonstone, which looked like a tiny, burnt pebble floating in an endless sea of blue velvet. The midday sun hit the clouds beneath us, turning the fog into a vast sea of white foam. Perhaps the simple fact that I was riding atop an actual dragon made the entire experience feel deeply magical and surreal. Naturally, my hyperactive brain immediately supplied an intrusive thought: what would happen if I somehow slipped out of this velvet harness and plummeted 10,000 feet down into the freezing water below? Splat, instant infant soup on the surface of the sea. Luckily, I was fairly certain that was not going to happen today, as Visenya had tied the leather buckles with double-knotted martial precision. Vagar had surprisingly not reacted violently to my playful infant smack across her snout earlier in the courtyard. The gargantuan bronze beast had merely let out a warm, sulphurous huff of air that had blown my silver hair straight back and covered my face in dragon snot. Even my mother had been taken aback by my brazen audacity, letting out a chuckle of amusement at the sight of her 4-month-old babe trying to physically assert dominance over a dragon. Who knew these fire-breathing monsters possessed such subtle intelligence? Staring directly into Vagar's massive golden eyes had been a deeply unsettling experience, not simply because she was an apex predator capable of swallowing an ox whole, but because those eyes held a strange, ancient, calculating intellect. It sent a cold shiver sliding down my spine. The only thing I could compare it to from my previous life was staring into the eyes of a wild chimpanzee or a massive timber wolf. You could tell there was a conscious, thinking mind behind those pupils, evaluating you with cold precision. Bika Daria, Isi Dare. It is beautiful, is it not? Visenya's soft, musical voice drew me out of my internal monologue once again. Once more, I found myself frowning in deep irritation, wondering if I was suffering from some strange ear infection. But no, the weather up here was tranquil, the flight was smooth, and there was no wind noise obstructing my ears. My mother was definitively speaking in an entirely different language. It took me a few seconds of narrowing down linguistic possibilities to reach the obvious, frustrating conclusion: she was speaking High Valyrian. That was supremely annoying. In the castle nursery, I had gotten comfortably accustomed to everyone speaking the common tongue, allowing me to easily overhear every scrap of castle gossip without raising suspicion. Nobody ever filtered their words around a 4-month-old infant because everybody assumed babies were mindless, uncomprehending lumps of squishy flesh. Visenya let out another quiet, raspy laugh, a sound so entirely alien on her stern face that it creeped me out far more than anything she had done till now. Ah. Heros Vedas, Ader Zugas. Aurobris Demeris Geomagan Syha Hen Valley, ah. Why do I even speak to a simple babe? Though you seem far wiser than other children I have seen. I stared up at her sharp, sculpted jawline, wondering if she was normally this talkative when she was alone. Probably not. Queen Visenya was famous for her ice-cold demeanor, stern discipline, and martial paranoia. But up here, 10,000 feet above the mortal world with no guards, septons, or maesters around to observe her, she clearly felt safe enough to drop her formidable guard for a fleeting moment. Chaos Rai, Au Isi Nua, that is because you are mine. My infant frown deepened as she pulled me closer against her leather-wrapped chest, burying her cheek against my soft, silver-haired head. I was deeply annoyed at my inability to comprehend her High Valyrian words. Couldn't she just speak in plain, simple common tongue like a normal person so I could figure out what kind of mother she actually was? You would not believe the disgusting, sexual, outrageous and terrifying all at the same time secrets those wed nurses spilled to one another when they thought no one was listening. It helped pass the agonizing hours of crib captivity, but occasionally the dark, medieval gossip made me shudder. May the gods protect me from the madness of bored servant women. Still, my modern brain was already hard at work cataloging the specific phonetic sounds and repeating words Visenya had just uttered, trying to cross-reference them with my limited knowledge of High Valyrian grammar from pop culture. I was not making much progress, and I could not help but wonder how the hell actual historical babies managed to pick up complex languages so effortlessly without the benefit of a fully developed brain. Aegon was at the castle a few nights past, Visenya suddenly murmured, her tone shifting drastically as she abandoned High Valyrian and lapsed into the familiar, crisp cadence of the common tongue. He received a sealed parchment from the Prince of Dorne, brought by the hand of Princess Daria herself. A single letter, yet it contained something that made him halt the entire war without a word of explanation. Thank the heavens, God had clearly smiled upon me. The glorious common tongue was back. English superiority wins again. The goat. Wait, What was she talking about right now? A sealed letter from Dorne. My infant mind instantly snapped to high alert. Oh right. That letter. The infamous, mysterious Dornish letter from the First Dornish War. By the sound of Visenya's bitter, venomous tone, she was profoundly furious about the entire incident. I craned my short neck upward, staring at her face. Her high cheekbones were tight, her full lips were pressed into an unyielding line of pure rage, and her gloved hands were gripping Vogger's leather reins so tightly that the metal studs were groaning under the strain. It irks me far more than it should, Visenya spat, her dark purple eyes flashing with cold, suppressed fury as she stared out over the clouds. No, I have every right in the seven hells to be enraged. We fought this bloody war side by side. We burned their castles together. He had no right to keep the contents of that parchment secret from me. After everything I have sacrificed for his crown, after Merix's was pulled from the sky at Hellholt. She exhaled sharply through her nostrils, a puff of warm white condensation escaping her lips into the freezing air before she fell silent, staring bitterly into the horizon. I felt a small pang of sympathy for my scary dragon mother. Here she was, a warrior queen who had spent years roasting Dornish fortresses to avenge her sister Rhaenys, only for her king husband to suddenly sign a peace treaty because of a private letter he refused to share with her. Deciding to offer her some comfort, I reached up with my tiny, fat hand and clumsily patted her cheek. I would have preferred to pat her shoulder, but the physical angle was completely wrong for my stubby, four-month-old arms, leaving me no choice but to awkwardly rub my sticky baby palm against her cheekbone. Visenya flinched in surprise at the touch, looking down at me. Her furious expression softened by a fraction, and she let out a long, weary sigh, resting her gloved hand over my tiny fingers. Her rant had reignited my own obsessive fan theories regarding the contents of that legendary Dornish letter. Back in my previous life, many fans had spent over a decade endlessly debating what Princess Daria had written to Aegon the Conqueror to make him abandon his bloody crusade. George R.R. Martin had intentionally left the detail completely ambiguous in the Fire and Blood history book, likely because he could not come up with a realistic, logical geopolitical reason for the Dornish to win the war, so he resorted to a mysterious plot device. But evaluating the historical facts through my analytical lens yielded a few compelling theories. Given that Aegon had sliced his own hands open on the blades of the Iron Throne upon reading the letter, before flying straight to Dragonstone and agreeing to a peace treaty the next morning, the contents had to be deeply personal. The popular theory that Rhaenys had survived the crash of Merix's at Hellholt and was being brutally tortured in a Dornish dungeon seemed plausible, with the letter offering her a merciful death in exchange for peace. However, the 3-year gap between her crash and the letter made that timeline somewhat shaky, and it was quite impossible to keep something like a secret for so long. The other theory of her leaving everything for someone in Dorne never made much sense to me either, because why would a queen who loved her husband and child abandon them for no reason? The only theory that made sense to me, however, was that the Dornish had preserved Rhaenys' body and offered it up to Aegon as a sign of peace. Of course, those were all just speculative theories. A game theory. Go go gaga, ga go go. I babbled aloud to Visenya, waving my chubby infant arms around in wild, theatrical gestures to properly illustrate my brilliant geopolitical breakdown of the Dornish conflict. Naturally, I possessed the vocal control to speak basic English words at this point, but revealing that factual reality right now would be absolute suicide. Superstitious medieval nobles would immediately declare me a demon, lock me in a dark tower, or call a septon to perform an exorcism. So instead, I fully committed to delivering my complex historical thesis in passionate, loud baby babble. Wait a second, my paranoid brain suddenly interjected. Wouldn't it look extremely suspicious if my infant babbling only consisted of the exact same 2 syllables repeated over and over? Any perceptive warrior queen like Visenya might notice the uncanny repetition and deduce that I was faking it. To throw off any potential suspicion, I threw in a chaotic mix of random consonants, wet raspberries, and dramatic grunts, concluding my grand speech with a satisfied huff. Phew, expressing such complex geopolitical theories through the medium of infant gibberish was genuinely exhausting work. My eyelids were already growing heavy, and my baby biology was demanding an immediate nap. Visenya stared down at me with a look of mild bewilderment, clearly having understood 0% of my brilliant historical analysis. Instead of taking my tactical advice to heart, she simply let out a quiet laugh, reached down, and affectionately pinched my fat, pink cheeks with 2 leather-clad fingers. How utterly humiliating. I was a reborn visionary dictator, not a squishy plush toy for her amusement. Just as I was about to give in to the overwhelming fatigue and close my eyes for a mid-air nap, something caught my attention. I froze, narrowing my eyes to peer past Vogger's bronze shoulder into the far distance. High above the white cloud cover, a distinct black speck was carved into the pale blue sky, carving through the atmosphere at a terrifying speed and heading straight toward our position. Chapter 5. It has recently come to my deeply disappointing attention that I am, in fact, not very big. Well, that is not entirely true. I am actually quite a large, heavy-boned babe for my age, but I had been operating under the assumption that I was already at least 6 months old. As it turned out, according to the hushed chatter of the handmaidens this morning, I was a measly, squishy 3-month-old infant. How depressing. At the very least, I was abnormally thick-limbed for a 3-month-old babe. Thank you, Supreme Targaryen Genetics. Please do your magic and transform me into an absolute, brick-shit-house, brute unit of a man when I grow up. I genuinely could not wait to get older so I could start swinging a 3-pound steel warhammer into the skulls of my political enemies. In every grand strategy game and role-playing campaign I ever played back in my previous life, I always dumped all my available stat points into raw physical strength while completely ignoring intelligence. I saw zero reason why I shouldn't live by that exact same sacred philosophy in actual medieval reality. Then again, historical records from my previous life indicated that the original Maegor Targaryen was actually a relatively sane, fiercely capable warrior in his early years. It was only after he took a spiked iron morningstar directly to his forehead during his famous trial of 7 against Sir Daemon Morrigan and the warrior's sons that his brain melted into pure, murderous mania. That brain damage, combined with the blood sorcery of his Pentoshi wife, Tiana of the Tower, resulted in a reign of nightmare terror, missing organs, and winged, dragon-like stillborn infants. Well, a clear lesson had been learned today. I was definitely going to stay at least 100 leagues away from scary, dark magic Pentoshi goth sorceresses in this life. Looking at my pathetic reflection in the polished bronze mirror propped against the nursery wall, I let out a heavy, infant sigh and collapsed backward onto my padded blanket and began to roll across the stone floor. At this developmental stage, I could barely manage a pathetic, uncoordinated army crawl across the blanket. As a direct result, I had no better, more efficient medium of personal transportation than simply rolling over and over like a fleshy log until I bumped into my intended destination. After a considerable, exhausting physical effort that left me wheezing, I managed to roll my fat body back into the carved wooden railings of my playpen, flopping onto my back with a long, frustrated grunt. Yesterday had been thoroughly thrilling with my high-altitude dragon flight atop Vagar, but today I was once again trapped inside this bleak, blackstone prison with zero hope of escape in sight. In the far corner of the chamber, my 5-year-old brother Aenys was sleeping peacefully upon his soft, feathered cushions. While it was occasionally amusing to irritate the soft-hearted boy, even picking on my future king got boring after a while. How in the hell did actual, normal medieval infants spend their waking hours without losing their absolute fucking minds? Having literally nothing better to do, I stared up at the vaulted, obsidian ceiling, letting my hyperactive brain reflect upon the wild events of yesterday afternoon. When I had first spotted that ominous black speck descending through the cloud cover high above the narrow sea, my heart had leapt into my throat. I had genuinely believed it was the cannibal, the monstrous, wild dragon who devoured its own hatchlings, and I had braced myself for an epic, main character dragon duel early in my second life. But no, the flying shadow had actually turned out to be none other than Balerion the Black Dread himself, with my royal father Aegon the Conqueror perched atop his iron saddle. The sheer, staggering magnitude of that black dragon had made me shiver to my very core. The sheer size of the beast was utterly unnatural. No living creature on Earth should have been capable of growing that massive. That realization only made another glaring logistical question even more confusing to my modern mind. How in the 7 hells were the Targaryens actively feeding not 1, but 3 gargantuan, fire-breathing monsters on a daily basis? Now that Aegon had conquered the 6 kingdoms, it was undoubtedly much easier to keep their massive bellies full by demanding thousands of sheep, cattle, and swine as royal tax tribute from the mainland lords. But what about the century before the conquest, when House Targaryen was just a solitary noble family sitting on a barren, volcanic rock in the middle of the sea? How had the dragons eaten back then? Did they just fly over to the neighboring kingdoms of the Vale, the Reach, and the Stormlands every single afternoon to slaughter and devour their livestock? If that had been the case, how had the petty kings of Westeros not banded together to wipe House Targaryen out 100 years ago? Perhaps the raw, unadulterated terror of dragonfire was simply far greater than the outrage of having a few hundred cows stolen every week. Or perhaps the dragons were diving deep into the ocean to hunt giant sea monsters. Leviathans, kraken, and giant squids from the abyssal depths. I could not recall whether that particular snippet of lore was another useless piece of fanfiction I had read on Reddit or actual canonical lore written by George himself. Could dragons even swim? It seemed plausible in theory, given that their body mass would feel considerably lighter under the water, but I still doubted a giant, fire-breathing reptile could dive 10,000 feet into the icy abyss without suffocating or drowning. Besides, krakens and deep-sea leviathans probably dwelt at the very bottom of the ocean floor. I highly doubted a dragon could hold its breath long enough to go deep-sea fishing, or maybe it could. Actually, their lungs' capacity was probably very big to keep that body functioning. Letting out another wide, toothless yawn, I prepared to drift back off to sleep. As a developing 3-month-old babe, 16 hours of daily sleep was biologically necessary for my brain to grow. But my eyelids snapped back open as I heard heavy, iron-shod boots clanking heavily against the stone corridor outside the nursery. Should I bother turning my head to see who was entering the room? That sounded like far too much physical work for a lazy afternoon. Then again, a paranoid voice in my head whispered, what if it was an assassin sent by some vengeful Dornish lord or a bitter faith fanatic wielding a dagger coated in manticore venom? If that were the case, I was completely fucked, but it was still vastly better to look my murderer in the eye than to get butchered in my sleep. Actually, on second thought, getting murdered while fast asleep was probably entirely painless. If I was awake when the dagger struck, I would likely spend my final moments gurgling on my own warm blood and suffocating in agony on the floorboards. Fortunately for my survival, I did not need to roll over to identify the intruder. Heavy footsteps crossed the threshold, and a towering figure stepped directly over my wooden playpen. I had gotten somewhat accustomed to adults bending down to stare at my infant face, yet it remained an intensely unnerving, deeply weird experience through my tiny baby eyes. The face currently staring down at me was not one I had seen anytime recently. He possessed a sharp, regal jawline, a broad, rectangular face structure, and a thick mane of silver gold hair falling over his forehead. His features were partially obscured by the dark shadows of the room, making it difficult to discern the exact shade of his eyes, though I was willing to bet my life they were either deep purple or dark indigo. Standing right above my crib was none other than my noble father, King Aegon I Targaryen, the Conqueror himself. Reaching down into the pen, Aegon placed his large, heavy hands beneath my armpits and lifted me up awkwardly into the air to take a proper look at my face. What was with these high-born dragonlords picking me up like a sack of turnips? Had no one ever taught these people basic infant handling safety? Actually, considering this was a brutal medieval society, no one had probably ever written a parenting book on infant care in the first place. Now that his face was clearly illuminated by the torchlight, I could not help but feel a sudden wave of deep uncertainty. Aegon was not the invincible, godlike warrior king I had pictured in my mind. He was physically massive, yes, his shoulders were easily the broadest I had ever seen on a human being, built for wielding heavy steel and riding a titan into battle. Yet at the exact same time, he looked strikingly meek, worn down, and utterly defeated. His purple eyes appeared hollowed out and sunken into his skull, surrounded by deep, dark circles of exhaustion. A dark, unkempt stubble covered his jaw, and new lines of grief were carved into the corners of his mouth. Aegon the Conqueror looked like a man who had been dragged through the seven hells and back again. Which, historically speaking, was completely accurate. He had spent the last several years waging a horrific, bloody war of attrition in the scorching deserts of Dorne, losing his beloved sister-wife Rhaenys, her dragon Merryxes, and thousands of loyal soldiers, only to receive a mysterious, soul-crushing letter from Prince Naemor that had brought his entire conquest to a screeching halt. What a massive disappointment. That was a 4 out of 10 first impression at best, UNC. You need to try way harder next time if you want to impress your son. The king stared at my fat baby face for a long, quiet moment, looking as though he wanted to say something, but ultimately chose silence instead. He gently lowered me back onto the padded blanket inside my crib, turned on his heel, and walked slowly toward the far corner of the chamber. I strained my neck to watch where he was going, catching sight of him kneeling beside Ennis's bed. Aegon reached out with a soft, affectionate smile, tenderly stroking my elder brother's silver hair and whispering quiet Valyrian words to him while the boy slept. He treated Aenys with a gentle, loving warmth that he had not shown me for even a single second. Unbelievable, blatant parental favoritism already. Well, to be entirely honest, I could not bring myself to give a shit. I was not an actual, emotionally fragile baby who was going to cry about an absent father or lack of paternal affection. So long as Aegon stayed out of my way, gave me absolute freedom, and supplied me with enough gold, land, and steel to build my own empire when I grew up, he would be the absolute goat father in my book. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Queen Visenya leaning silently against the stone archway of the door. She was watching Aegon dote on Aenys with an unreadable, stone-cold expression on her face, her jaw set like solid obsidian. I could not help but wonder what thoughts were racing through her mind as she watched her husband show such tenderness to Rhaenys' son while ignoring her own newborn babe. But I was not given time to ponder her marital drama for long, as my mother pushed off the doorway, strode across the chamber, and scooped me up into her leather-armored arms. Sinagon Vezo King's Landing, we are flying to King's Landing, she muttered under her breath in High Valyrian, her voice clipped and cold. Be Enosa, Emeluso Kiditsos Herenka. Beside me, we shall have a fortress of mud. King's Landing, that was the only words that I could make out. Now that sounded interesting. If my historical mental timeline was correct, King's Landing at this point in history was not the massive, foul-smelling metropolis of 500,000 citizens, cobble streets, and stone septs that it would eventually become. For now, it was merely a fledgling, chaotic boomtown built around the crude, timber and earth walls of the Egenfort atop Aegon's high hill. To be entirely fair, I would have much preferred to stay in the dark, majestic stone security of Dragonstone, but it made logical strategic sense that the royal family was returning to the mainland now that the bloody war with Dorne had officially ended. Deep physical exhaustion overtook my infant body not long after, my brain completely drained of energy from all the philosophical thinking and physical rolling. A day later, I was flying through the freezing sea sky once again, strapped securely to Queen Visenya's leather-armored chest atop Maegor's back. Why in the hell couldn't these highborn Targaryen dragonlords travel like normal, civilized human beings on luxury sailing ships or comfortable wooden carriages? Just kidding, of course. If I possessed a mountain-sized, fire-breathing dragon of my own, I would never set a single foot on the muddy ground to travel like a pathetic, NPC peasant ever again. The icy sea wind whipped savagely past my baby cheeks as I narrowed my purple eyes with a loud, dramatic huff. Why did my mother insist on strapping me to the front of her chest plate where every stray gust of wind, sea spray, and bug smacked me directly in the face? Actually, looking at it from a purely logical perspective, this arrangement was vastly safer. If she had tied me to her back instead, I might have accidentally slipped out of the leather harness and plunged 10,000 feet to my death without her even noticing until we landed. Just how ridiculously fast were Targaryen dragons, anyway? That was the scientific question I had been attempting to calculate for the past hour of flight. While I had no accurate way of measuring our exact elapsed time because I had fallen fast asleep during our departure from Dragonstone, I was 99% certain that dragon travel was infinitely faster than medieval galleys. It was undeniably the fastest mode of transportation in this entire fantasy world. At the same time, I severely doubted a dragon could fly anywhere near the cruising speed of a modern commercial airliner. Or perhaps they could. It was difficult for my modern brain to gauge proper atmospheric velocity without a speedometer, but I was fairly certain that if Maegor were moving at 500 miles per hour, the sheer air pressure would have flattened my baby's skull and ripped the skin right off my face. Anyway, that topic was better left unanalyzed. It was a universally acknowledged truth among fantasy readers back in my previous life that Georgie was notoriously terrible with his numbers, distances, and wall heights to begin with. It is known, as Maegor tilted her massive bronze wings and began a long, sweeping descent through the gray cloud cover, a far more important geographical sight caught my attention directly below us. Stretching out along the muddy banks of the Blackwater Rush was the infant settlement of King's Landing. The site was a chaotic, muddy mess. The fledgling capital looked less like an imperial seat of power and more like a sprawling, filthy war camp that had spiraled completely out of control. Thousands of crude wooden hovels, leather tents, thatch-roofed taverns, and wattle and daub hovels were packed tightly together along narrow, winding dirt tracks that were churning with brown mud, horse dung, and raw sewage. Dozens of merchant galleys, longships, and fishing smacks were crammed into the docks along the riverbank, their wooden masts looking like a forest of toothpicks from our high vantage point. Smoke curled lazily into the sky from hundreds of open campfires, forge chimneys, and cook spits, hanging over the settlement like a thick, greasy haze that smelled faintly of roasted fish, wet wood, and unwashed bodies. Perched atop the highest hill overlooking the muddy chaotic expanse stood the Egenfort. It was a crude, formidable structure, constructed entirely from thick timber logs, earthen ramparts, and heavy wooden palisades, with tall watchtowers bristling with iron spikes. It lacked the dark, ancient majesty of Dragonstone's fused black stone, looking more like an oversized frontier fort than a royal palace, but it possessed a raw, martial grandeur nonetheless. Maegor, Rebaz, Maegor, listen, Visenya commanded, her voice ringing out like a steel blade as she pulled on the heavy leather reins. The gargantuan bronze dragon let out a deafening, earth-shaking roar that echoed across the entire bay, sending thousands of birds exploding out of the trees and causing the tiny, ant-like people in the muddy streets below to scatter in sheer terror. Maegor banked hard to the left, her massive shadow sweeping across the sprawling timber roofs of the fledgling city as we lined up our landing vector directly toward the wide, muddy outer bailey of the Egenfort. I leaned my heavy baby head forward against the leather straps, staring down at the muddy capital of Westeros with a wide, wicked infant grin. Time to start planning my eventual rise to power. Chapter 6. The year was 17 AC, 17 years after my father set foot on the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, and life in the fledgling capital of King's Landing was utterly magnificent. The air was sweet, the sewage system was a triumph of modern engineering, the local populace was polite, and the royal palace was a glowing monument to majestic architecture. Yeah, that was a complete and utter lie. This place sucked ass. Even though 4 years had passed since my mother first carried me here from Dragonstone, the place had not grown on me in the slightest. The Egenfort was a glorified, mud-splattered timber pile barely holding itself together atop the highest hill in the city. Alright, fine, perhaps I was exaggerating slightly. Over the past few years, my father's stonemasons had finally begun replacing the original wooden palisades with crude curtain walls made of Grey River stone, making the fortress somewhat sturdy and moderately comfortable. But that was about the extent of its charms. There were no exquisite Valyrian silk tapestries hanging from the walls, no grand arched corridors, and no massive four-poster beds with feather-stuffed mattresses. If I had to compare the castle to an architectural style from my previous life, it would be cold, functional Soviet brutalism. It was entirely understandable, considering the fortress had to be thrown together in a hurry during the conquest, but I personally believed it was high time Aegon renovated this fuck-ass heap. Either that, or I could simply wait for the old man to kick the bucket and rebuild the entire capital myself. For the most part, however, I did not lose sleep over the fortress's ugly stone walls, because I spent the vast majority of my time on Dragonstone anyway. Dragonstone was infinitely better in every conceivable way: dark, terrifying, steeped in ancient blood magic, and blissfully quiet. Letting out a wide yawn, I stretched my arms above my head and surveyed my rather mediocre bedchamber inside the Eggenfort. Now, a casual observer might look at me and assume I was acting like a spoiled, high-born brat complaining about his castle accommodations. That could not be further from the actual truth. I did not give a single damn where I slept, so long as the room was dry and free of cold drafts. But looking around this gloomy, barren chamber with its single narrow slit window and unadorned stone walls, I could not help but notice that my royal father was playing obvious favorites once again. I was 5 years of age now, having been born in the 12th year after the conquest, though physically I looked far more like a 10-year-old child. I was thick-boned, broad-shouldered, and possessed heavy wrists that made my arm muscles look like iron cables. Maybe that was an exaggeration as well. Probably not. As far as my father was concerned, I did not particularly care about him, and he in turn barely acknowledged my existence. All was fair at the end of the day. I could easily understand why King Aegon doted so heavily on my elder brother Aenys. Aenys had been born in 7 AC to Queen Rhaenys, the beloved sister-wife whom father had lost in the sands of Dorne 7 years ago. Aegon clearly viewed raising Aenys as his sacred, tragic responsibility to her memory. Still, understanding his grief did not justify his blatant neglect in my eyes. If I were a normal 5-year-old child instead of a reincarnated soul, I would have developed a catastrophic Freudian complex and spent my teenage years crying into my pillow over my daddy issues. Fortunately, that was not a case. Though, whenever father and I bumped into each other in the corridors, we were perfectly civil in an awkward, distant sort of way. A sharp, distinct knock echoed against the heavy oak door of my room, shattering my quiet reflections. Raising a dark silver eyebrow, I pushed off the wooden stool and walked lazily across the floorboards to open it. The moment the heavy door swung inward, a slender, silver-haired child quickly darted past my waist, ducking into my room and frantically scanning the corners like a thief on the run. It was none other than my brother, Prince Aenys Targaryen himself. Before closing the door, I threw a quick, amused glance at the ironclad Kingsguard knight standing post in the hallway outside. Why in the 7 kingdoms did the royal bodyguard have enough spare knights to post full-time guards outside 5-year-old children's bedchambers? The knight on duty today was Sir Robin Darklyn, a veteran warrior whose name I only remembered because of his infamous courtly nickname, Darkrobin. What a goofy-ass nickname. That name sounded like it belonged in a gloomy teenage metal band, though his actual physical appearance was completely mundane. He had plain brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and wore the shining, polished steel plate and pristine wool cloak of the Kingsguard. Sir Robin caught my purple eyes, cleared his throat awkwardly, and offered me a strained smile. I returned the gesture with a flat smile of my own before pulling the door shut between us. Honestly, if I were a grown knight of the Kingsguard and I had to interact with a 5-year-old child like me, I would be terrified of the kid too. It is what it is. Turning back around, I observed Aenys as he paced around my room. I rarely saw my brother these days, as I spent most moons brooding in the volcanic towers of Dragonstone while he remained at court, but whenever possible, he had begun seeking out my company whenever we were under the same roof. Clad in a fine tunic of violet silk lined with golden thread, the 10-year-old prince was technically twice my age, yet physically we were nearly the exact same height. What he possessed in vertical height, he severely lacked in physical density. Aenys was slender, pale, and narrow-shouldered, looking as though a strong gust of sea wind might snap him in half. His watery purple eyes shone with genuine warmth as he reached into his tunic, hiding whatever small object he had brought with him behind his back. "Brother, it is good to see you," Aenys said, his voice light, brimming with childhood enthusiasm. "There is so much I have been longing to tell you." I forced a soft, easy smile onto my face and scratched the back of my neck. To be completely transparent, I never quite knew how to converse with him. At his core, Aenys was a sweet, frail, naive child, whereas my mind was that of a mature person. Engaging him in normal childhood chatter was remarkably difficult, at least on the days when I wasn't busy beating his ass to the floorboards for fun. In the beginning, I had been deeply conflicted about how to treat Aenys. From a cold, ruthless strategy perspective, my elder brother was the primary obstacle standing between me and the Iron Throne. Yet I held a strong, visceral aversion to the idea of murdering him. In Georgie's universe, kinslaying was the ultimate, unforgivable taboo, cursed by the old gods, the new gods, and every cosmic force in existence. Murdering your own blood was a guaranteed way to ensure your eventual, horrific downfall, and I already had enough medieval hazards to worry about without inviting ancient blood curses onto my head. As the years marched on, my internal stance on fratricide had softened even further. Aenys was genuinely fond of me. While I actively tried not to foster deep brotherly affection toward him, just in case he met a tragic end or political necessity forced my hand down the road, it still felt dirty to contemplate throat-slitting a boy who looked at me with unconditional trust. My current long-term plan was far simpler. I would sit back, cultivate my own power, and wait for his fragile immune system or a bad riding accident to do the heavy lifting for me. Aenys, on the other hand, held zero reservations about our relationship. For reasons I could not entirely fathom, my frail elder brother practically worshipped the ground I walked on, idolizing me and my quiet demeanor as though I were a mythical hero from the Age of Heroes. Realizing that the quiet silence in the chamber was becoming prolonged, I dispelled my thoughts and offered him a polite response. "It is good to see you as well, Aenys. How have you been faring?" I sauntered over to the tall, narrow window, leaning my heavy forearms against the stone ledge to peer down at the sprawling settlement below. King's Landing was hardly a true city yet. It was a chaotic, disorganized warren of wooden hovels, leather tents, and muddy tracks. Yet everywhere I looked, construction gangs were hard at work. Masons were hauling granite blocks, carpenters were hammering roof beams, and draft horses were dragging heavy timber wagons through the mud. It was slow, ugly work, but the capital was undeniably taking shape before my eyes. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, but did you know that father went out somewhere again?" Aenys exclaimed, rushing over to my side with his eyes shining like bright amethysts. He carefully withdrew his hands from behind his back, revealing a sharp object held delicately in his hands. While leaving, he gave me this. I leaned down to inspect the dagger. It was indeed a striking specimen. The surface of it was a brilliant, shimmering silver, laced with intricate, swirling veins of pale sky blue that seemed to catch the sunlight streaming through the window. All in all, however, it was a completely normal dagger, nothing magical or Valyrian about it, much to my disappointment. "I have been keeping it with myself at all times, just in case I get attacked," Aenys babbled, his voice rising in excitement as he gently stroked the handle. "I can't wait to learn how to use it." "That is wonderful news, Aenys," I replied smoothly, offering him an encouraging nod to keep him happy. "Surely you will make a fine assassin, or whatever." To be honest, I was not very interested in the dagger. It looked rather boring to me overall. And in my own expert and intelligent opinion, Aenys would forget about it pretty soon as well. As expected, Aenys continued to chatter endlessly about potential names for his dagger, before it lost his attention and he started to ramble about his dragon instead. Quicksilver, if I was not wrong. I hadn't seen it yet, but it was supposed to be a beautiful beast, something that would die by my hands in the future. Or would it? It was hard to say now. A sudden, thunderous roar echoed across the sky, vibrating through the stone walls of the chamber and rattling the glass panes in the window frame. The deafening sound instantly silenced Aenys's chatter. We both turned our heads toward the sky, gazing out over the mud-drenched roofs of the city. High above the clouds, a massive, terrifying shadow was carving through the heavens, blocking out the sun as it swept over the Blackwater Rush. It was Balerion the Black Dread. Even from miles away, the sheer, staggering scale of the Black Dragon was breathtaking. His jet-black wings spanned the horizon like a storm cloud, his long, armored tail whipping through the air as he glided effortlessly above the capital. He was an absolute apex predator, an unnatural living weapon of mass destruction that made every human achievement below him look utterly pathetic. Aenys stared out the window with wide, fearful eyes before turning back to face me, his curiosity piqued. "What about you, Maegor?" Aenys asked, his voice quiet with genuine wonder as he paced around my wooden stool. "Your mother told me that you rejected every single cradled egg the dragonkeepers offered to you in your nursery. You refused them all and have not asked for another since. What dragon do you intend to ride when you come of age?" I did not answer him immediately. Instead, I leaned back against the rough stone wall, resting my heavy hands on my hips while my purple eyes tracked the serpentine, terrifying silhouette of the Black Dread circling high above the Eggenfort. A small smile crept onto my face as I stared into the sky. "I have my eyes set on one dragon only," I murmured softly, my voice echoing in the quiet chamber as I watched the King of Dragons roar into the wind. "And I will accept no other." Chapter 7. Turning away from the narrow slit of the window, I leaned my back against the rough, cold stone of the wall, studying my brother. Aenys was holding a short, strange iron dart in his right hand, examining it with a look of bewildered, intense curiosity. It was the item he had quietly stolen from one of the small oak drawers beside my bed. The object consisted of a sharpened steel spike fused to a heavy, teardrop-shaped lump of solid lead, balanced by 3 clipped goose feathers glued to a wooden tail. He pressed the fleshy pad of his thumb against the needle-sharp point, instantly letting out a sharp, pathetic hiss as a tiny bead of crimson blood welled on his skin. He jerked his hand backward as though he had been stung by a wasp. "Ouch, what manner of foul toy is this?" Aenys muttered, sucking on his pricked thumb while staring at his stained skin. I sauntered over to him, snatched the weighted dart out of his delicate fingers, and held it up to the dim sunlight filtering through the window, admiring my handiwork. "I call it a plumbata," I replied with a shrug. The craftsmanship was admittedly crude, forged by a sleepy, confused blacksmith in the lower courtyard of Dragonstone whom I had badgered with specific drawings until he yielded to my demands. I had zero intention of mass-producing these weapons anytime in the near future, mostly because traditional longbows, heavy crossbows, and iron-tipped lances were vastly superior for true battlefield warfare. I had only fashioned this particular piece because it was ridiculously easy to construct and I had been bored out of my absolute mind during a rainy fortnight on the island. The plum what?" Aenys asked, scratching his silver-haired scalp. Before I could even begin to explain the mechanics, his short attention span betrayed him. He turned away and began pacing aimlessly around my bedchamber, turning over leather-bound scrolls and examining the brass inkwells scattered across my table. Seeing that my fragile brother was thoroughly distracted, I slipped the lead-weighted missile safely into the hidden inner pocket of my wool tunic. In the ancient history of my previous world, the plumbata had been a devastating, short-range-throwing weapon utilized with deadly effect by late Roman infantry legions. Soldiers carried 5 of these heavy, lead-weighted darts clipped into the hollow interior curve of their large shields. When an enemy infantry line or a wall of cavalry charged toward their ranks, the soldiers would unleash a lethal, high-trajectory hail of plumbatae overhand or underhand from 40 paces away. The heavy lead weight fused beneath the iron barb gave the projectile immense kinetic momentum, allowing it to punch cleanly through leather armor, iron ringmail, and wooden shields long before the two armies ever clashed hand to hand. I had invented the weapon in this world purely because it was a simple, fun engineering project to keep my mind occupied inside a 5-year-old body. Unfortunately, I had not yet been given a single opportunity to test the dart out on a live target, which was a deeply depressing state of affairs. I was quietly praying that some arrogant, full-mouthed noble squire in the courtyard would provoke me so I could lodge an iron barb into his thigh. Unfortunately, almost every boy in the castle was terrified of me. Perhaps my habit of beating up annoying high-born children for fun had not been the most tactical decision on my part, as my reputation made finding living test subjects for my weapons remarkably difficult. "Oh, right, I nearly forgot the main reason I came to your room," Aenys said, turning around after failing to find anything remotely interesting on my bookshelves. His face twisted into a slight frown. "Your mother sent me to fetch you. Queen Visenya demands your presence for the morning meal in her private solar. Are you not coming to eat with us?" I asked, stepping toward the heavy oak door as he pulled it open. A look of visible, deep-seated panic flashed across Ennis's soft face. He let out a nervous, dry cough into his fist, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. "No, I must head down to the lower yards," Aenys stammered, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I need to check on my dragon. I swear I felt Quicksilver calling out to me this morning, and I must be there for her, like a proper dragon rider." I almost snorted, heading that was a blatant lie, almost, because I did not do it and instead merely shrugged my broad shoulders and let him have his dignity. Poor kid, someone should teach him to lie. Visenya was a terrifying, stern dragonlord who carried a Valyrian steel sword on her hip and spoke in sharp, razor-thin commands. Aenys was a gentle, sensitive boy who looked as though he might burst into tears whenever she looked at him too intensely. It was entirely understandable that he would make up a ridiculous excuse to avoid sitting across a breakfast table from her. I stepped out into the stone corridor, watching my brother scurried away down the hall like a frightened field mouse. As the heavy oak door swung shut behind me, the Kingsguard knight standing post outside immediately fell into step behind my left shoulder, his iron boots clanking heavily against the flagstones. I threw a quick, sidelong glance at the man out of the corner of my eye. The knight was Esser Humphrey the Mummer, one of the 7 sworn brothers of the Kingsguard. It was another absurd nickname, but I found the man's history genuinely fascinating. Back in the 10th year after the conquest, after a band of bitter Dornish assassins ambushed King Aegon and Queen Visenya in the muddy streets of the fledgling city, Visenya had personally drawn Dark Sister, cut down 2 assassin captains herself, and declared that the king required a permanent brotherhood of elite, fanatically loyal warriors to guard his life night and day. She had handpicked the original 7 based on raw skill rather than noble bloodlines. Esser Humphrey had been a landless hedge knight's bastard who had earned his colorful moniker because he had spent his youth working as a tumbling acrobat and sword juggler in a traveling mummers troupe before turning his martial talents to tournament melees. "Good morrow, Esser Humphrey," I said, breaking the quiet silence as we navigated the winding stone staircases of the Eggenfort. The sky looks remarkably clear this morning. Having literally nothing better to do with my time, I figured I might as well make casual conversation with the terrifying, white-cloaked killer walking behind me. He was a solid, reliable warrior, or so I assumed, given that my mother would never allow an incompetent fool to wear the white cloak, let alone permit him to stand guard outside my personal bedchamber. "It is a bright morning, my prince," Sir Humphrey replied curtly, his voice echoing flatly from beneath his polished steel helm. "A fine day for the yard." "Indeed," I murmured, having nothing else to say. Fortunately for both of us, our brief walk came to an end as we reached the stout timber door leading into Queen Visenia's private chambers. I raised my heavy hand, knocked twice on the oak planking, and waited until my mother's stern, commanding voice rang out from within, "Enter." I pushed the door open, stepped inside the chamber, and closed it firmly behind me, leaving Sir Humphrey to stand post in the hallway outside. I paused to glance around the room. Visenia's private solar was sparsely decorated, borderline monastic in its bare simplicity. There were no gilded mirrors, no plush SOC carpets, no vibrant tapestries depicting great historic battles. There was only a plain, sturdy table carved from dark mountain oak, a few iron candelabras holding unscented tallow candles, and a tall, narrow window that looked out over the muddy bay. Tisk, tisk, it was blatantly obvious that my royal father Aegon was not allocating any meaningful portion of the crown's gold toward interior decorating or domestic comfort. Setting my petty complaints aside, I turned my attention toward the far end of the room. Queen Visenia was seated at the head of a long wooden table, surrounded by a lavish spread of breakfast foods. She wore a simple, high-collared gown of dark, midnight purple wool, her long silver-gold hair woven into a tight, intricate braid that rested over her left shoulder. Beside her chair, resting against the oak table leg, was Dark Sister in its dragon leather scabbard, the dragonglass pommel gleaming in the morning light. A silent servant woman stood motionless in the shadow of the corner, whom I promptly ignored as I walked across the stone floorboards and took a seat directly to my mother's right. Visenia looked up from her plate, her dark violet eyes scanning my face with a cold, sharp, calculating intensity. She gave me a single, crisp nod of approval. "Eat your fill, Maegor," she said, her voice smooth and hard as dragonglass. "We have important matters to discuss once you are done." I hummed in response, reaching out to pile my pewter plate high with food, wondering what exactly she could be talking about. Maybe it was some super secret plot to make me the king. Or give me a power-up that would transform me from a level 5 brute to a level 10 brute. The theories in my head got wilder the more I thought about it. I immediately dug in like a starving hound. While highborn royalty in Westeros lived in luxury compared to the peasantry, the culinary reality of this fantasy world was a deeply depressing affair for a reincarnated modern man. Spices were practically non-existent in this medieval realm. Real, fiery, mouth-numbing spices like chili peppers, Szechuan peppercorns, and cumin were virtually impossible to acquire, given that trade routes to the far eastern lands of Yi and Ashai were long, dangerous, and wildly expensive. Ever since I was reborn into this world, I had not eaten a single dish that possessed actual, genuine heat. Oh, how I missed the spicy Chinese street noodles and rich Indian curries of my previous life. I swore to myself that as soon as I grew old enough to command my own flagship, I was going to sail straight to the Jade Sea purely to plunder their spice markets. Then again, upon deeper reflection, perhaps eating super spicy food in a medieval fantasy setting was a terrible idea. The less said about the primitive, horrifying state of Westerosi castle plumbing, the better. Taking a massive dump in a drafty stone garderobe where cold sea air blew directly up your bare ass was an unpleasant experience under normal circumstances. Doing so after eating a bowl of spicy fire peppers sounded like a specialized form of hellish torture. At the very least, the food served at the royal table was high quality and plentiful. I devoured several rashers of thick, salted bacon, 2 poached capon legs dripping with savory pan juices, a wedge of sharp, hard goat's cheese, and half a loaf of crusty barley bread slathered in churned yellow butter. Once I was completely stuffed, I set my golden spoon down upon the wooden board with a loud clatter and picked up my pewter goblet, chugging the cold liquid within. It was pure, boiled water mixed with a splash of tart lemon juice. It was entirely thanks to my relentless, vocal insistence over the past 5 years that the entire royal household had begun boiling their drinking water. My desire to not die a pathetic, agonizing death by shitting my internal organs out from dysentery was exceptionally strong. Now that I thought about it, the sheer number of times I spent worrying about dying from bloody flux or diarrhea was absurd. Hopefully, the cosmic gods of this universe were not listening to my internal rants and plotting to make my fears a reality. Visenia waited patiently until I finished my drink, setting her own silver goblet down on the oak table. Her symmetrical, striking face was as calm and unreadable as a marble statue, her purple eyes tracking my every movement. "You must have noticed that your father was absent from the Great Hall last night," Visenya spoke softly, her tone carrying a quiet, dangerous weight. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and nodded. I noticed. I assumed he was busy managing the construction of the curtain walls or meeting with the stonemasons. I had arrived back from Dragonstone yesterday afternoon and had not seen Aegon anywhere in the castle yards. That was hardly an unusual occurrence for me, given that my father rarely sought out my company anyway, so I had simply assumed he was buried in royal paperwork or overseeing the city guard. Clearly, that was not the case, and even Aenys had mentioned that he had went out. Leaning back against the tall, carved wood of her chair, my mother folded her arms across her chest. He has left me to take care of the affairs of the realm again. She let out an annoyed sigh, but that is not what I wanted to inform you, Maegor. Taking a sip of water from a goblet, Visenya continued, her purple eyes boring into mine. Various heirs of the realms will be coming here for their fostering, around your age. After that, she did not say anything more, instead choosing to stare at me simply. I gave her a slow nod at the implications. What was the line again? Let the Game of Thrones begin. Once again, Visenya pulled back slightly and removed the sheathed sword from around her waist, laying it flat against the wooden table. For now, train with Sir Humphrey and make friends. But one day, when you're worthy, this will be yours. She drew the sword out slightly, letting me catch a glimpse of the beautiful blade within in all its magnificent glory of perfect ripples and smoky metal. One day, Dark Sister will be yours. Chapter 8. Stepping through the heavy oak threshold into the outer corridor, I closed the door behind me and paused, letting my mind mull over the words my mother had just said to me. Dark Sister. It was a magnificent piece of art. Back in my previous life, I had seen custom Damascus steel swords crafted by master smiths, but the Valyrian steel of Visenya's longsword was on an entirely different level of dark, unnatural beauty. The folded metal rippled with intricate, smoky whorls of dark gray and deep black, lighter than common iron yet far harder than any castle-forged steel. It was fascinating to ponder the lost metallurgy of the Valyrian freehold. Modern maesters loved to speculate on the secrets of dragon-forged steel, but I was fairly certain the process required blood sacrifice, dark sorcery, and hot dragonfire to bind the metal. Unlocking the secret to forging Valyrian steel once again would alter the entire geopolitical landscape of Westeros. Unless I stumbled upon some forgotten, dust-covered grimoire hidden in a secret crevice deep beneath Dragonstone, however, figuring out the magical chemistry on my own would be impossible. Perhaps I should organize a naval expedition to the Smoking Sea and the ruins of ancient Valyria sometime in the future. Surely my thick, main character plot armor would protect me from the deadly, ash-choked sea hazards, right? I certainly had zero intention of becoming a tragic, cautionary footnote in an Archmaester's history scroll warning young lords not to sail into the doom. Then again, if I were ever foolish enough to sail into those haunted, ruinous waters, I had better make sure I built a functional magnetic compass first. Though if the magnetic poles of this planet were warped by some ancient eldritch sea monster dwelling beneath the waves, a simple needle wouldn't do me much good anyway. If my historical memory served me correctly, the original Maegor was gifted Dark Sister by Queen Visenya when he reached his 13th name day, right after he was knighted in a grand tourney. Later in his life, his brother Aenys would hand over Blackfire, the great hand-and-a-half bastard sword of the Conqueror, upon taking the Iron Throne. Waiting until I turned 13 to wield Dark Sister was acceptable enough, but I was damned if I was going to wait decades to get my hands on Blackfire. That blade belonged on my hip. Turning away from my grand thoughts of magical swords, I spotted Sir Humphrey the Mummer standing post beside the stone archway, staring out through an iron portcullis at the muddy bustling courtyard below. The moment he heard my leather boots scrape against the stone, the Kingsguard knight turned his head, offered me a crisp, formal nod, and smoothly fell into step behind my right shoulder. My mother should have already informed you of the morning's arrangements, Sir. I asked, throwing a casual glance at him over my shoulder as we descended the wide stone stairs. She has, my prince, Sir Humphrey replied softly, his long, auburn hair rustling over his broad shoulders. His face was entirely relaxed, almost devoid of emotion. What was it with this current generation of Kingsguard knights being such stone-faced, emotionless fucks? Where was the joy, where was the colorful, dramatic flair? Tell me, Sir, I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the muddy yard ahead, how exactly did a warrior like you come to earn such a curious moniker? The Mummer. Sir Humphrey let out a quiet, raspy chuckle, a faint glimmer of warmth finally touching his brown eyes. Before the Queen raised me to the white, my prince, I was merely a landless bastard earning his bread in the traveling troops. I juggled flaming torches, tumbled on wooden stilts, and played the villain in cheap mummers' farces across the reach. I was a foolish performer who picked up a steel broadsword to defend our troop from road bandits, only to discover I was vastly better at cutting men down than making peasants laugh. He paused, his voice softening into genuine reverence. When Queen Visenya held the grand melee to choose the royal guard after the Dornish ambushed the king, she cared nothing for my lack of noble blood or my foolish past. She saw only my blade and my loyalty. Her grace pulled me out of the dirt and wrapped this silk cloak around my shoulders. I owe her my life, my honor, and every breath I draw. I nodded thoughtfully. At the very least, my mother possessed an uncanny, razor-sharp eye for choosing fanatically loyal men for crucial positions. From my knowledge of the future, out of the 7 original Kingsguard knights chosen by Visenya, 2 would eventually give their lives defending King Aegon from assassins, while the rest served the royal family with unyielding, selfless devotion until the day they died. Finding men of such absolute, unbroken integrity was nearly impossible in a treacherous medieval world. Soon enough, our boots were squelching through the thick, churned brown mud of the lower training yards. The courtyard was a hive of chaotic martial activity. Dozens of squires, armored knights, and local men-at-arms were loitering around the weapon racks, mending leather doublets, sharpening iron spearheads, and clashing dulled steel swords. Under normal circumstances, a 5-year-old high-born prince would be assigned some low-ranking castle master-at-arms to teach him how to hold a wooden shield, but Visenya demanded the absolute pinnacle of martial instruction for her son. Who was I to complain about getting personal sword lessons from a sworn brother of the Kingsguard? To be entirely fair, it had always baffled my mind why so many modern self-insert stories featured main characters who actively avoided or whined about martial training. Refusing to master the sword in a brutal medieval realm like the Seven Kingdoms was mind-bogglingly stupid. Martial prowess was the primary currency of nobility in Westeros. It was the fastest, most effective way to command the respect of the lords, intimidate your rivals, and ensure that when some bitter enemy challenged you to a trial by combat, you didn't end up with your skull caved in by a warhammer. Naturally, not everyone was born with the natural physical talent to be a legendary swordsman, but practicing the fundamentals every single day was basic survival logic. Sir Humphrey slipped away toward the armory racks while I was lost in my internal monologue, his leather boots clacking against the muddy gravel. He returned a moment later holding a stout, carved wooden practice sword in his right gauntlet. "This is where your journey begins, my prince," Sir Humphrey said, stepping backward and offering the hilt of the wooden blade to me pommel first. He raised a dark eyebrow in subtle surprise when I silently took the weapon without a single word of complaint. He had clearly expected a pampered 5-year-old prince to throw a childish tantrum, demanding a real, shiny steel blade or throwing a fit about starting with simple wooden toys. But while I thoroughly enjoyed acting like an unhinged, dramatic chaotic demon for my own personal amusement, I was not an idiot. I wrapped my fingers around the carved grip, shifting the weight and testing the balance of the wooden sword. It was considerably heavier than it looked, weighted with lead inserts near the cross guard to mimic the feel of actual castle-forged iron. Fortunately, the blade length was perfectly proportioned for my oversized, 5-year-old frame. The true essence of any fight, whether it takes place in a grand tourney ring or a bloody alleyway, is your balance and your footwork, Sir Humphrey said, stepping in close and circling around me like a hawk. Raw physical strength means nothing, my prince. Lightning speed means nothing if your feet slip in the mud and you fall upon your own blade. He reached out with his gloved hands, gently adjusting my fingers on the leather grip, ensuring my thumb was rested properly against the guard. Then he tapped the back of my knees, forcing me to lower my stance until my center of gravity was low to the mud, my broad feet spaced apart to anchor my heavy frame firmly to the earth. Satisfied with my initial position, Sir Humphrey stepped back 3 paces and held out his bare hand. "Hand me the blade for a moment, my prince." I handed the wooden sword back to him without hesitation. Rotating the blade in his fingers so that the heavy wooden pommel was pointed directly at my chest, the Kingsguard knight suddenly lunged forward, thrusting the pommel straight into my left shoulder to knock me off balance. Now this was actually quite fun. While I was certainly no legendary sword prodigy yet, my years of life experience had given me a thorough, intuitive understanding of human weight distribution, martial arts mechanics, and physical leverage. All those late-night hours spent watching MMA breakdowns, boxing tutorials, and historical fencing videos on YouTube back in my previous life were actually paying massive dividends. The moment I saw his shoulder move, I shifted my weight onto my rear right foot, engaged my core muscles, and absorbed the force of his thrust without giving up an inch of ground. Sir Humphrey blinked in genuine admiration, stepping backward as he realized my feet remained rooted into the churned mud. He ran a gloved hand through his long, auburn hair, a warm smile breaking across his face. "By the 7, you have the balance of a mountain goat, my prince," Sir Humphrey marveled. "Most boys your age tumble headfirst into the dirt the moment I touch their shoulder. Very well, if your footing is already sound, we shall move directly to the next stage of your instruction." Motioning for me to follow him, the Kingsguard knight led me toward a thick, scarred wooden post planted deep into the mud near the far wall of the courtyard. The wood of the pell was gouged, splintered, and stained dark from years of receiving blows from steel and oak. Sir Humphrey handed my wooden sword back to me, stepped aside, and crossed his arms over his white cloak. "Strike the pell 6 times, Prince Maegor," Sir Humphrey instructed firmly. Deliver 3 strikes with every ounce of physical strength in your arms, and deliver the remaining 3 with absolute precision, aiming for the carved red line near the top. Keep the low guard I showed you, and do not let your grip loosen upon the hilt. I took a deep breath, rolled my broad shoulders to stretch my muscles, and adjusted my grip on the leather handle. Settling into my low, rooted stance, I swung the wooden sword with all the explosive force my broad 5-year-old chest could muster, slamming the oak edge directly against the solid post. The impact rang out through the training yard like a thunderclap. The sudden, violent shockwave traveled straight up the wooden blade, through my wrists, and rattled the bones in my shoulders. My fingers instantly went numb, and the wooden sword nearly twisted out of my hands, flying into the mud. Sir Humphrey nodded sagely, stepping forward to adjust my forearms. Do not fight the impact, my prince. Squeeze the grip at the exact moment of contact, but keep your wrists flexible to absorb the vibration. I gritted my teeth, reset my feet, and delivered another furious blow. This time, I tightened my grip at the instant of impact, letting my core absorb the shock. The wooden blade hit the post with a satisfying, deep thud, remaining firmly locked in my hands. Hours bled away into the late afternoon as I stood in the muddy yard, relentlessly hacking, slashing, and thrusting at the wooden pell without uttering a single word of complaint. I had already known from my previous life that physical exercise and hitting heavy bags was a fantastic way to relieve mental stress, but I hadn't realized how therapeutic chopping a wooden post could be. By the time the sun began to dip behind the timber towers of the Eggenfort, my small arms felt like raw, burning noodles, and my woolen tunic was completely drenched in cold sweat. Just as my forearms were about to give out entirely, Sir Humphrey stepped forward and gently caught the flat of my wooden blade, bringing my training to a halt. A look of deep, profound respect shone in his brown eyes. He took the wooden sword from my trembling fingers, allowing me to finally lower my arms to my sides. I let out a long, ragged exhale, suddenly realizing that my throat was as dry as desert sand. You possess a remarkable, terrifying work ethic, Prince Maegor, Sir Humphrey said, placing a heavy, gloved hand on my shoulder as I stood there panting. I shook out my aching arms, standing tall to see that the Kingsguard knight was gesturing toward another knight who was watching us from the edge of the yard. The second knight was clad in gleaming, unadorned steel armor, a dark blue cloak wrapped around his shoulders. After observing your natural balance and your absolute refusal to yield to exhaustion, Sir Humphrey said, his voice solemn and formal, we have decided that it would be vastly more beneficial for you to experience a true sparring match against a living opponent. A warrior never truly learns the art of steel by beating a silent wooden post. It is only in the chaos of a bout that your instincts are forged. I narrowed my dark purple eyes. Was this veteran knight trying to humble my 5-year-old arrogance by putting me in my place? It was of zero concern to me regardless. All I cared about was the glorious prospect of smacking an actual person with a wooden sword to test my newly acquired skills. The blue-cloaked knight beckoned to a young boy standing beside the armory racks. The boy trotted over, holding a wooden sword and a small leather shield. He looked to be roughly 8 or 9 years of age, slender but tall, with an arrogant, snub-nosed face and dark hair. He was clearly a high-born squire who had spent the last 2 years practicing his swordplay under proper castle tutors. Sir Humphrey stepped between us, holding up his gauntleted hand to establish the rules. This will be a gentle, controlled bout. No thrusts to the throat or face are permitted. The first fighter to land a clean, decisive touch of his blade upon his opponent's torso shall be declared the victor. The snub-nosed squire looked down as I sneered. It would be for the best if I destroyed all his hopes of beating me before the fight even began. Hell yeah, get that right, I was a best your puny ass to the ground even though I started learning like 5 hours ago. However, everyone knew that the only thing that mattered at the end of the day was talent. Yup, definitely. Well, how delightfully cliché. I had read this exact same web novel trope 1,000 times in my past life. The arrogant, high-born young master looks down on the protagonist, expecting an easy victory, only to get thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire crowd. Except in this particular story, I was the terrifying, broad-shouldered royal young master. Time to break the script and deliver a thorough beatdown. Sir Humphrey stepped back, raising his hand into the air. Begin. The squire didn't hesitate for a single second. Eager to end the match swiftly and impress the watching Kingsguard, he lunged forward with a loud, aggressive battle cry, swinging his wooden sword in a broad, sloppy overhead arc aimed directly at my shoulder. He was moving fast for an 8-year-old, but his weight distribution was a complete disaster. He was leaning far too far forward, his feet crossed in the thick mud, leaving his midsection completely exposed. To my eyes, his dramatic overhead swing looked like it was moving in slow motion. Instead of trying to block the heavy blow with my own sword, which would have shattered my sore, exhausted arm muscles, I utilized basic footwork. I pivoted on my left foot, slipping beneath his wooden blade as it whistled uselessly through the empty air where my head had been a second before. The squire's eyes went wide with sudden, blind panic as his own momentum dragged him off balance, his feet sliding helplessly through the slick brown mud. Before he could recover his balance or raise his leather shield, I stepped inside his guard, shifted my weight onto my rear leg, and drove the flat of my wooden blade directly into his exposed ribs with every ounce of physical strength remaining in my 5-year-old body. Thwack! The crack of wood against his leather doublet rang through the quiet yard. The sheer kinetic force of my short, heavy blow knocked the breath entirely out of the squire's lungs. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak, his knees buckling beneath him as he tumbled sideways into the thick, wet mud, rolling over twice before coming to a halt at Sir Humphrey's boots. The knight looked at the boy on the ground, groaning as he picked himself up, before turning his head towards me, respect in his gaze. I stood over the fallen boy, breathing steadily, holding my wooden blade in a relaxed, low guard as I wiped a speck of mud from my cheek. Sir Humphrey stood motionless for a moment before he stepped forward, placed his heavy gloved hand on top of my silver-haired head, and let out a booming laugh that echoed off the stone walls. "Yield, match to Prince Maegor," Sir Humphrey proclaimed loudly, his voice filled with overwhelming pride. He turned to look at the blue-cloaked knight, who was staring at me as if he had just witnessed a 5-year-old boy tame a wild shadowcat with his bare hands. By the warrior's sword, Sir Harry, the boy didn't just land a touch, he nearly broke the lad's ribs with a single pivot. "A magnificent, brilliant strike, my prince." I offered Sir Humphrey a modest, polite nod, though internally I was strutting around like a king. "A lucky strike, Sir," I said smoothly, handing my wooden blade back to him. He left his footing in the mud. "Nonsense," Sir Humphrey laughed, clapping me on the shoulder so hard I nearly stumbled. "That was not luck, that was pure, martial instinct. Come, Prince Maegor, you have earned your wash and your wine today. Let us get you cleaned up before Queen Visenya hears that her 5-year-old son is already knocking squires into the dirt." As I walked out of the training yard beside the white-cloaked knight, leaving the muddy, bruised squire to be helped up by his master, a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. One day, I thought to myself, those wooden blades will be forged of dark Valyrian steel, and those muddy squires will be rival kings. And I will crush them all the exact same way. Wait, that sounded a little too emo. Can we dial that down a little? Also, what was Sir Humphrey yapping about wine? I would never drink something like that in a world like this. Chapter 9. I raised my arms high above my silver-haired head, letting out a long, theatrical stretch that set my shoulder joints popping like dry firewood. By the gods, that had been a thoroughly productive morning. My muscles were screaming from hours of hacking at the wooden pell, my knuckles were bruised, and my wool tunic was soaked through with sweat, yet a deep, satisfying sense of physical accomplishment buzzed through my veins. The fresh, crisp air blowing off the Blackwater rush tasted remarkably sweet up here on the hill. In my previous life, every breath of city air was laced with diesel exhaust, industrial smog, and microplastics. Out here in 17th year after the Conquest King's Landing, despite the occasional whiff of horse manure and rotting fish drifting up from the muddy harbor below, the sky was completely unpolluted and pristine. Right now, all I wanted in the world was a steaming hot bath to scrub the mud out of my skin, followed by a quiet hour in my solar reading dusty histories before heading out again. The morning was still remarkably young, after all. Catching sight of a young castle servant boy shuffling down the stone hallway with a wicker basket of soiled linens, I raised a commanding finger. "You there, run down to the bathhouse and inform the attendants to prepare a boiling tub for Prince Maegor. Tell them I want lavender oil and plenty of dry towels." The boy nearly dropped his basket in terror, his eyes going wide as saucers as he bowed so low his nose nearly scraped the flagstones. "At once, my prince. Right away," he stammered, before turning on his heel and bolting down the corridor like a whipped cur. I watched him go with a slight grin, resuming my leisurely stroll back toward my private bedchamber. The intense physical exertion of the training yard had sent a wave of pure, serene clarity rushing through my mind. It made high-level strategic thinking feel entirely effortless. If I was being completely honest with myself, I could easily get addicted to this glorious physical high. No wonder the original Maegor Targaryen grew up to be such an absolute, unstoppable terror on the battlefield. When you combine supreme Valyrian dragon-riding genetics with a relentless, fanatical work ethic, the resulting human being was built to conquer worlds. Reaching my bedchamber, I pushed open the heavy oak door, throwing a polite nod over my shoulder to my white-cloaked shadow. "Rest your legs for a moment, Sir Humphrey. I shall be inside a short while." "I shall hold the door, my prince," Sir Humphrey replied curtly, taking up his post beside the iron wall sconce. I stepped inside, pulled the thick door shut, and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. Taking a deep breath of the quiet room, I pulled my sweat-stained linen tunic over my head and tossed it casually onto the chest at the foot of my bed. Breakfasted and breathing comfortably, I dropped to my hands and knees on the cold flagstones, reaching my long arm deep into the dusty dark beneath my bed frame. My fingers brushed against a loose stone in the masonry near the baseboards. I pried the flagstone back, reaching into the hidden hollow cavity beneath to retrieve a thick, leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled calfskin. Now, I was well aware that hiding a top-secret document beneath one's bed was arguably the most cliché, amateur move in the history of espionage. But frankly, I did not care in the slightest. Who in this fuck-ass castle was going to be unemployed and suicidal enough to go crawling under the bed of Queen Visenia's 5-year-old son? If a servant girl came in to sweep the dust, I would simply move the book to another secret crevice. For now, it served its purpose perfectly. Carrying the leather journal over to my oak writing desk, I opened the small wooden side drawer and pulled out a handheld brass mirror. I pulled a high-backed wooden chair over to the desk, sat my heavy frame down, and propped the mirror upright on the desk surface directly behind the open book. Next, I unstoppered a small glass vial of dark galnut ink and retrieved a sharpened goose quill. I let out a soft, annoyed sigh as I dipped the feather tip into the black ink. Gods above, I genuinely needed to invent a proper graphite pencil one of these days. Writing with a goose quill was a tedious, messy, utterly infuriating process. Every 3 sentences required dipping the nib, blowing on the wet parchment to prevent smudging, and carefully scraping away stray ink splatters with a small iron blade. The only reason I hadn't thrown the foolish feather out the window was because it looked undeniably cool sticking out of a bronze inkwell. If Targaryen dragons possessed feathers, I would have personally plucked a golden plume from Vagar to make a quill. Unfortunately for my aesthetic tastes, giant fire-breathing reptiles had scales instead. I wondered briefly if mythical phoenixes actually existed in the far-off, unexplored jungles of Sothorios or the shadowed mountains beyond Ashai. Now that would make a truly magnificent quill. Shaking the stray thoughts from my head, I cracked open the thick journal, flipping past dozens of densely written pages until I reached a fresh, blank sheet of vellum. Adjusting the angle of the mirror so it reflected the page directly before my eyes, I lowered the quill and began to write. Now, why exactly was I writing in front of a mirror, and why was this entire process so convoluted? The answer was remarkably simple: absolute, paranoid security. The mirror allowed me to write in fluid, inverted handwriting, mirror scripting from right to left like Leonardo da Vinci back in my previous world. But even if some clever court maester or sneaky royal spymaster managed to hold my journal up to a mirror to read the reversed letters, they would still be greeted by complete, unreadable gibberish. That was because I was not using the common tongue or High Valyrian script at all. Instead, I was writing in a completely different script from my previous life. Being multilingual in a medieval fantasy universe was an absolute, glorious superpower. Even if King Aegon, Queen Visenya, and the Grand Maester of the Citadel teamed up to analyze my secret journal, they would spend 20 years assuming I was scribbling dark, eldritch blood magic runes from across the Jade Sea. And what, precisely, was I recording inside this secret ledger? Everything, every single crucial piece of scientific knowledge, engineering blueprint, agricultural crop rotation strategy, and military tactic I could recall from my modern education. I wrote detailed distillation procedures for clean alcohol and antiseptics, blast furnace designs for refining high-grade steel, and basic notes on modern sanitation and medical hygiene to basically anything and everything. Furthermore, I recorded every single future historical event, rebellion, assassination, and political betrayal from George R.R. Martin's books that I could remember. If I ever suffered a severe blow to the head during battle, like the original Maegor did during his famous trial of 7, or if my human memory began to fade as the decades marched on, this book would serve as my ultimate, unassailable hard drive backup. I was halfway through scribbling a detailed structural diagram of a Roman-style waterwheel saw when 3 sharp, polite knocks echoed against the oak door of my chamber. "Your bath is prepared, my prince," the black-haired servant boy called out from the hallway. "Understood," I called back smoothly. I instantly closed the leather journal, wrapped it tightly in its oiled calfskin cover, and slid it back into its secret stone hollow beneath the bedboards, fitting the flagstone back into place with a quiet click. I pocketed the brass mirror in my drawer, wiped my ink-stained fingers on a rag, and pulled a clean linen shirt over my broad chest. Along the way, I shoved the plumbata in one of the drawers as well. Unbolting the door, I swung it open to find the young servant standing beside Sir Humphrey, holding his hands clasped tightly before his woolen tunic. The boy bowed deeply, keeping his eyes glued to his worn leather boots. "If it pleases your grace, I can lead you to the bathhouse chambers." "No need, lad, I know the way," I said pleasantly, reaching into the pocket of my trousers and pulling out a heavy, gleaming copper star. I tossed the coin through the air toward him. The boy caught the copper coin with surprising reflexes, staring at the stamped metal in absolute, wide-eyed disbelief. A copper star was more coin than his peasant family saw in a fortnight of brutal castle labor. "Thank you, my lord. May the 7 bless your grace," he squeaked, bowing 3 times in rapid succession before practically dancing down the corridor in joy. Now, this was precisely the point where other reborn, modern protagonists in web novels love to whine and complain about the horrors of feudal nobility, grumbling about how uncomfortable it felt to have servants bowing to them or offering them basic deference. Not me, though, never not me. This royal life was hands down the absolute best existence imaginable, and I had zero intention of ever giving it up. The raw, unchecked political power I held over common men was not something I gloated over, but I deeply appreciated the absolute respect and deference afforded to my bloodline. If I was being entirely honest with myself, I vastly preferred ruling through genuine respect rather than mindless terror. Men who obeyed you out of sheer fear would eventually slip a drop of nightshade into your wine glass the second your back was turned out of desperate self-preservation. But men who respected your strength, rewarded your generosity, and believed in your leadership would gladly march into the mouth of a dragon for you. "Shall we, Sir Humphrey?" I asked, stepping out into the corridor and gesturing toward the main staircase. "Lead on, Prince Maegor," the Kingsguard knight replied, falling into his customary position 3 paces behind my left shoulder, his white wool cloak rustling against his greaves. We climbed the wide spiral staircase of the Eganfort, stepping past drafty stone archways where the morning sun streamed through, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Servants hauling oak buckets, guardsmen holding steel spears, and high-born squires carrying velvet doublets all halted in their tracks as I walked past, flattening themselves against the stone walls and bowing their heads in deep respect. I was merely a 5-year-old child, yes, but I was a Targaryen prince who stood nearly as tall as an 8-year-old boy, with broad shoulders and the icy purple eyes of a conqueror. As we navigated the quiet upper corridors, I decided to break the silence. "Sir Humphrey, tell me truly, do you never grow utterly weary of trailing 3 paces behind my backside and staring blankly at cold stone walls for 12 hours a day?" The Kingsguard knight did not break his cadence, his iron-shod boots striking the flagstones in a steady, rhythmic pattern. "It is my sworn duty, my prince," he replied in his smooth, dry voice. "The stone walls do not plot treason against the royal blood, nor do they run away when I look at them. It is a remarkably peaceful post compared to fighting Dornish spearmen in the Red Mountains." I let out a laugh. "A fair point, Sir. Staring at stone walls is indeed a very useful hobby. I would certainly know a lot about it." Sir Humphrey let out a confused chuckle, not exactly sure what I was talking about but decided not to comment on it as we arrived at the tall, bronze-studded doors of the royal bathhouse. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, taking a long, deep breath of the thick, warm steam that filled the room. The royal bathhouse was an absolute, glorious masterpiece of stone and marble architecture. If there was one single luxury my father Aegon had refused to skimp on when constructing the Eganfort, it was the royal baths. The entire chamber was lined with dark grey river stone and polished white marble brought by ship from the Vale of Arryn. The high vaulted ceiling featured carved stone vents that allowed the dark grey smoke to escape while trapping the soothing heat within. In the center of the room sat a massive, sunken circular tub carved from a single block of black granite, fed by a network of heavy copper pipes that ran directly from giant water cauldrons heated by wood fires in the vaults below. Now, there were many aspects of this medieval fantasy world that I could complain about endlessly. The plumbing. We do not talk about the plumbing. The lack of modern dentistry, the absence of refrigeration, and the primitive state of medicine were all thoroughly depressing. But there was one simple, magnificent reality that made all those medieval hardships completely bearable: being a high-born royal prince. The absolute opulence, luxury, and comfort I enjoyed up here in the royal quarters were unmatched by anything else in the continent. 4 young, attractive female bath attendants, clad in simple linen gowns with their sleeves rolled up to their elbows, immediately stepped forward from the shadows, bowing low before me. I had specifically instructed the master of the household moons ago that only female attendants were to be assigned to my personal baths. I had zero interest in having hairy, burly medieval men scrubbing my skin with stiff brushes. "Thank you very much." "Welcome, Your Grace," the head bathmaid whispered softly. "The water is hot and scented with crushed lavender and almond oil." With practiced, quiet efficiency, the handmaiden stepped forward and untied the laces of my linen shirt, slipping the garment off my shoulders before unbuckling my leather belt and shoes. Standing naked on the warm marble floor, I stepped down the short stone stairs into the steaming black granite tub. The moment my feet touched the water, I let out a loud, pathetic groan of absolute bliss. The water was piping hot, bubbling softly from the copper feed pipes, and heavily infused with the sweet, soothing fragrance of fresh lavender buds and sweet almond oil floating on the surface. I sank deep into the tub until the steaming water reached my chin, resting my sore back against the smooth, curved granite wall. Every single ache, knot, and spasm in my overworked shoulder muscles instantly began to melt away under the glorious heat. The handmaidens gathered around the edges of the granite tub, setting to work with gentle precision. One girl held a carved wooden cup, scooping up warm water and pouring it gently over my silver gold hair, while another applied a thick, sweet-smelling soap lather milled from olive oil, goat's milk, and crushed rosemary leaves. Her long, slender fingers massaged my scalp with gentle, rhythmic pressure, working out the tension in my neck until my eyes rolled back in my head. A third maid used a soft sea sponge to gently scrub the dark mud, sweat, and dried dirt off my chest, arms, forearms, and legs, while the fourth girl massaged my aching calf muscles beneath the bubbling water. Floating in the fragrant, boiling water while 4 attentive handmaidens massaged my sore muscles was an experience so deeply, obscenely comfortable that I came dangerously close to falling fast asleep right then and there. My eyelids grew heavy, my breathing slowed to a deep, peaceful rhythm, and my brain finally drifted into a state of total, blissful rest. Alas, all good things had to come to an end. After nearly an hour of pure relaxation, the water began to lose its intense heat, and I snapped myself out of my peaceful trance. I raised my heavy arms, signaling to the maids that I was finished. The attendants immediately rushed forward with thick, warm wool towels, wrapping them around my shoulders and waist as I stepped up out of the stone tub. They led me over to a padded wooden bench near the hearth fire, drying my skin and combing the damp silver locks of my hair until it glistened like polished dragonglass in the firelight. Now, I wasn't able to use the servants to their full advantage, but when I grow older. Once I was dry, 2 servants produced a brand new, elaborate outfit that my mother Queen Visenya had personally selected for me earlier that morning. I let out a slight, quiet scowl as I looked at the garments. It was a formal, high-born riding ensemble made of the finest, most expensive materials in the 7 kingdoms. There was a doublet of rich, midnight black velvet embroidered with crimson dragon scales along the lapels, paired with a tunic of dark Valyrian red silk that fell to my knees. The trousers were cut from soft, black lamb's wool, tucked into sleek leather riding boots dyed charcoal black and polished to a mirror shine. A wide belt made of linked bronze dragonheads was buckled tightly around my waist. I stood patiently as the handmaidens buttoned the velvet doublet and smoothed out the silk sleeves. While I personally preferred the loose, comfortable simplicity of a plain linen tunic and leather trousers for daily training, I had to admit that this new outfit looked incredible. Drippy as hell, my mother Visenya clearly understood the immense psychological value of personal presentation. She wanted everyone in the city to look at her broad-shouldered son and see a prince of blood and fire. Letting out a long, thoroughly refreshed sigh, I checked my reflection in the tall bronze mirror on the wall, adjusting the silver collar of my silk tunic. I turned on my heel, pushed open the bronze-studded doors of the bathhouse, and stepped out into the stone corridor, where Sir Humphrey was standing post, staring blankly at the wall masonry across the hall. "Sir Humphrey," I shouted cheerfully, snapping my leather gloves onto my broad hands with a sharp, loud crack. The Kingsguard knight turned his helm toward me, his brown eyes widening slightly as he took in my elaborate black and red velvet attire. I flashed him a wide grin, resting my hand on my hip. I desired to venture out into the city. Chapter 10. Pulling a heavy, coarse wool hood over my silver hair, I pulled the dark brown folds tight around my jaw to hide my Valyrian features. I looked down at my expensive velvet doublet and silk tunic, making sure they were entirely hidden beneath the drab traveler's mantle. Beside me, Sir Humphrey the Mummer had traded his pristine white wool cloak for a tattered, oil-stained coat of drab brown wool that looked as though it had been salvaged from the corpse of a hedge knight. The heavy fabric draped awkwardly over the sharp contours of his polished steel chestplate, but from a distance, he looked like nothing more than an oversized, scarred sellsword serving as an escort for a high-born bastard child. Initial objections from the Kingsguard had been swift and stern. Sir Humphrey had balked at the foolish notion of taking the king's 5-year-old son out into the unwashed, lawless chaos of the lower streets. It had taken 10 minutes of my relentless, persuasive nagging, combined with a subtle threat to sneak over the castle walls on my own, to break his resolve. In the end, the White Knight had relented. There was no active war in the realm, no Dornish assassin squads prowling the muddy alleys of Aegon's High Hill today, and Sir Humphrey possessed supreme confidence in his ability to split a man from collarbone to navel with his broadsword if anything went wrong. The wooden gates of the Eggenfort loomed above us, constructed from massive pine logs bound with heavy iron bands. The guards stationed at the post were not the grand, disciplined warriors of the famous City Watch. The gold cloaks did not exist yet in this era, but looking at the current gate garrison, the need for a proper police force was blindingly obvious. The men-at-arms lounging beside the portcullis wore mismatched leather doublets and greasy iron caps, leaning lazily against their spears as though they were paid to nap on their feet. Their posture was atrocious, their weapons were spotted with orange rust, and they lacked any semblance of military discipline. With a quick nod from Sir Humphrey, 2 gate guards grunted, leaning their heavy shoulders against the oak winches to push the heavy gate open just wide enough for us to slip through. We stepped out onto the gravel outer path, and the wooden gate slammed shut behind us with a dull, heavy thump that reverberated in the hollows of my ears. That was it. I was officially outside the walls of the Eggenfort. Aside from my dragon flights atop Vagar between Dragonstone and the mainland, this was the very first time my leather boots had ever touched the soil of the capital. Reaching up, I pushed a stray lock of silver hair out of my eyes and stood upon the grassy crest of Aegon's High Hill, taking in the sweeping vista of the fledgling city stretching out beneath my boots. The sight before me was a chaotic, disorganized mess. Down below, sprawled across the rolling hills and muddy riverbanks, stood the wild, undisciplined settlement of King's Landing. It was not a true city yet, but rather a swollen boomtown that had erupted like a fungus around the base of the fort. Thousands of crude wooden longhouses, wattle and daub shacks, thatch-roofed taverns, canvas tents, and makeshift timber shops were crammed together in complete, lawless anarchy. There were no paved stone streets, no grand arcades, and no urban planning whatsoever. The thoroughfares were merely twisting, uneven dirt tracks churned into deep brown troughs of mud by the constant passage of oxen, draft horses, heavy timber wagons, and thousands of unwashed feet. I shuddered to imagine the horrifying, slippery nightmare these steep slopes became whenever a summer downpour drenched the bay. There were no outer stone walls protecting the settlement either. The sprawling wooden camps simply trickled off into the tall, wild grasses of the countryside before cutting off abruptly near the treeline. Despite its primitive, chaotic appearance, the settlement was teeming with an astonishing density of human life. From my high vantage point, the people looked like an endless colony of ants, pushing, shoving, and shouting as they went about their daily labor. The collective noise rising from the lower tracks was overwhelming, a loud, ceaseless hum of shouting merchants, barking dogs, crying infants, and clattering iron wagon wheels that echoed all the way up the hillside. I shifted my gaze across the horizon, looking toward the two other prominent hills rising in the distance. To the west stood the high, grassy slopes that would eventually be named Visenia's Hill, where the Grand Sept of Baelor would one day dominate the skyline. To the south rose the Hill of Rhaenys, where the massive, dragon-filled dome of the Dragon Pit would eventually sit. At this point in history, however, both hills were virtually empty, dotted only with a few scattered sheep pens, goat herds, and solitary wooden huts sitting in the wild grass. Disappointed by the barren hills, I turned my attention toward the muddy banks of the Blackwater Rush. The riverfront was a dense, chaotic tangle of crude pine piers, rickety wooden docks, and floating timber wharves jutting out into the deep, dark water. Dozens of massive trading vessels were anchored in the bay or lashed to the docks. I spotted heavy merchant cogs from Pentos, Tirosh, and Merse sitting side by side with Westerosi trading galleys, longships from the Vale, and flat-bottomed river barges down from the Reach. The air blowing off the river was heavy with a thick, pungent mixture of salt spray, rotting seaweed, fried fish, wet timber, and sweet pine tar, so potent I could smell the sharp tang from all the way up the hill. The docks were undoubtedly the most vibrant, economically productive district in the entire town, packed with muscle-bound sailors, dockworkers carrying wooden crates, and loud hawkers shouting prices in half a dozen SOC dialects. Overall, my impression of the capital was thoroughly lukewarm. King's Landing, you are a complete, muddy disappointment. I am going to have to rebuild this entire fuck-ass city from the ground up when I take power. Suddenly, an interesting realization struck my brain. Where was the legendary, stomach-churning smell that King's Landing was universally famous for in the history books? The infamous stench of human waste, rotting offal, and stagnant sewage was surprisingly absent. Of course, the air smelled of wet mud, horse dung, and unwashed peasant bodies, but the overwhelming, citywide reek had not materialized yet. That was because the population, while large, was still spread across open fields rather than trapped inside towering stone tenement buildings. I made a firm mental vow that I would personally oversee the construction of a proper, Roman-style aqueduct and subterranean stone sewer system before this city grew into a 500,000-person cesspool. My nose would not suffer for the rest of my natural life. My attention shifted away from the riverfront toward the vast cluster of camps and wooden structures sitting directly at the eastern foot of Aegon's high hill. A thick, greasy haze of dark black smoke hung over that entire lower district, drifting upward like storm clouds to coat the timber roofs in dark soot. Even from high up the slope, I could hear the rhythmic, metallic ring of iron hammers striking anvils. Dozens of open-air wooden sheds, fitted with squat stone chimneys and roaring hearths, were clustered tightly together along the muddy tracks. My purple eyes glinted with genuine excitement beneath my wool hood. A dedicated blacksmithing district. Now that was thoroughly cool. As a man who possessed a deep, modern interest in historical weaponry, metallurgy, and engineering, I was not going to pass up an opportunity to inspect medieval metalworking up close. If you have satisfied your curiosity and finished admiring the city, my prince, we may proceed. Sir Humphrey's quiet, raspy voice broke into my thoughts. I threw a sharp, cocky smirk over my shoulder at the disguised knight. Sir Humphrey, let us descend and see what the city holds for us. We began our trek down the steep, slippery slopes of Aegon's high hill. I had to watch my footing carefully, as my 5-year-old boots slipped occasionally on the loose gravel and dry dirt, but my broad frame and low center of gravity kept me upright. Within 10 minutes, we had successfully navigated the hill and stepped onto the outer perimeter of the blacksmith district. The sudden transition into the dense crowd was almost overwhelming. The sheer volume of human noise, combined with the suffocating heat radiating from the open forge fires, hit me like a solid wall. Hundreds of people were packed tightly into the narrow dirt alleyways, ducking under low wooden awnings and stepping around deep mud puddles. The small folk of the fledgling city were a rough, ragged lot. Most of them wore simple, faded tunics of coarse gray or brown wool, patched at the elbows and stained with dark grease. Sweat-drenched sailors with silver hoops in their ears brushed shoulders with dirty peasant women carrying baskets of turnips, while mud-splattered beggar boys darted through the gaps in the crowd like feral cats. Everyone was pushing, shoving, and jostling against one another in a desperate, frantic hurry. Several burly sailors and drunken teamsters attempted to shove past me as I walked down the center of the track, but they failed miserably. Sir Humphrey moved like an invisible, unstoppable wall beside me. Without ever drawing his sword or raising his voice, the Kingsguard knight used his broad shoulders, heavy ironclad elbows, and sheer physical presence to subtly deflect oncoming bodies, clearing a smooth, uninterrupted path through the chaos from my broad 5-year-old frame. Spotting an oversized wooden smithy with a massive stone chimney spewing thick gray smoke, I turned on my heel and stepped beneath its low timber lintel. The moment I crossed the threshold, I was greeted by an intense, blistering wave of hot air flowing all around me, smelling heavily of glowing charcoal, singed leather, and hot iron. The interior of the smithy was a dark, cavernous space, lit primarily by the bright, fiery orange glow of two massive hearth forges glowing in the center of the room. Massive leather bellows, operated by a young, soot-stained apprentice pulling on a heavy wooden lever, pumped continuous streams of oxygen into the burning charcoal, sending towering gouts of orange sparks dancing toward the soot-blackened rafters. 3 muscle-bound blacksmiths, clad in thick, scarred leather hide aprons over bare, sweat-glistening torsos, were hard at work. The air vibrated with the deafening, rhythmic clang of heavy iron hammers slamming onto iron anvils. Narrowing my dark purple eyes, I folded my arms over my chest and walked around the perimeter of the shop, watching the metalworkers with interest. Sir Humphrey hovered directly behind my left shoulder, his hand resting casually under his brown coat near the pommel of his broadsword, his brown eyes scanning the shadowy corners of the forge. My attention was caught by a tall, barrel-chested blacksmith who was forging a brand-new steel broadsword from scratch. The man was working over a glowing anvil, holding a long, glowing orange bar of steel in a pair of heavy iron tongs. The ambient heat radiating from the metal was hot enough to singe my eyebrows, yet the smith seemed immune to the temperature, his face dripping with sweat as his heavy ball-peen hammer fell upon the hot metal with precise, thunderous strikes. The air splattered and sputtered, showering the earth and floor in bright yellow sparks as the smith hammered the glowing bar, gradually flattening and tapering the metal into the rough shape of a double-edged blade. I stood quietly in the shadows, watching every single step of his forging process with a critical eye. As the minutes ticked by, my initial intrigue slowly transformed into a deep, frustrated frown. The blacksmithing techniques practiced in this forge were simultaneously vastly better yet infinitely worse than what my modern, educated mind had expected. The smith possessed immense physical strength and muscle memory, yet his actual metallurgical science was riddled with glaring, catastrophic errors. As I observed his work, I identified 3 massive, critical mistakes that the blacksmith committed in rapid succession. The first error occurred during the folding phase. The smith was attempting to forge weld multiple layers of iron and low-carbon steel together to create a stronger blade. However, as he heated the metal in the forge, a thick layer of dark iron oxide, or scale, formed on the white-hot surface. Instead of throwing clean quartz sand or flux over the red-hot metal to dissolve the oxide scale before hammering, the smith simply pulled the bar directly out of the coals and slammed his hammer onto the unclean metal. By failing to use sand or flux, he trapped dark, glass-like slag inclusions directly inside the welded steel core. Those hidden slag pockets created permanent, invisible structural weak spots along the entire length of the blade. The second mistake was even more appalling. After hammering the blade into its final geometry, the blacksmith brought the steel back up to a bright cherry red heat in the hearth. He then pulled the blade out of the fire with his tongs and plunged it straight into a wooden trough filled with freezing cold river water. A massive cloud of white steam exploded into the air with a violent, hissing roar. The sudden, brutal thermal shock hardened the outer edge of the steel, but the rapid cooling created microscopic, invisible stress fractures deep inside the molecular structure of the metal. The blade looked fine to the naked eye, but the internal steel was riddled with microcracks. The very first time a knight swung that sword full force against a heavy oak shield or steel chestplate, the blade would shatter like glass. Finally, to complete his trifecta of metallurgical disaster, the smith pulled the blackened blade out of the water trough, wiped the moisture off with a filthy rag, tossed it onto a wooden table, and called it a day. He skipped the crucial tempering pass entirely. He made zero attempt to gently reheat the hard, brittle steel over a low flame to relieve the internal physical stress and grant the metal necessary flex and spring memory. Without tempering, the sword was nothing more than a glorified, overly brittle iron stick that was as brittle as glass. I stood in the dusty corner, staring at the finished broadsword resting on the workbench, letting out a long, disappointed sigh. The three errors were so glaringly obvious to my understanding of metallurgy that it took every ounce of my willpower not to walk over to the blacksmith. Then again, I was never a redditor who liked correcting people over their mistakes. Then again, upon deeper reflection, perhaps the smith was cutting corners on purpose. Perhaps the man who had commissioned this particular sword was low on coin, prompting the smith to skip time-consuming steps like tempering and fluxing to save money on charcoal. Or perhaps the master blacksmith simply didn't know any better. Regardless of his reasons, I was certainly not going to march up to a sweaty, 250-pound muscle-bound blacksmith as a 5-year-old child and try to play the arrogant smartass. Telling a master metalworker that his sword was useless garbage was a fantastic way to get a heavy iron tongs thrown at my head. I would keep my superior metallurgical secrets to myself for now. Turning away from the roaring forge, I signaled to Sir Humphrey, and we stepped out of the hot, soot-choked smithy back into the open dirt alleyway. The cool sea breeze blowing off the Blackwater rush hit my flushed face like a splash of cold water, washing away the suffocating heat of the forge fires. I took a long, deep breath of the fresh air, pulling my dark wool hood slightly lower over my silver locks. I paused beside a wooden hitching post, leaning my broad back against the timber while watching the chaotic flow of small folk, hawkers, and sailors passing through the muddy street. A sly, amused grin spread across my face beneath the shadows of my hood. Hey, would you look at that? I had successfully slipped out of the Eggenfort, traversed through the most chaotic district of the capital, inspected a medieval smithy, and survived the entire morning without a single assassination attempt on my life. I was single-handedly breaking all of the fanfiction stereotypes in existence. Where were the hidden poison daggers? Where were the shadowy mercenaries springing from the rooftops? The plot armor is strong with this one, indeed. Hopefully, I hadn't just jinxed my own existence by thinking those exact thoughts. Just then, I felt something brush past me. Chapter 11. The knight gave a sharp, downward jerk, wrenching the intruder out of the shadow of the wooden post. I looked down, expecting a drunken sellsword, only to realize the culprit was a scruffy, mud-splattered child, maybe around 13 or 15, it was always hard to tell with the malnourished ones. In his filthy left hand, the boy held my leather pouch, its velvet drawstring dangling between his fingers while the heavy coins inside jiggled with a muffled metallic chime. The kid scowled fiercely, his teeth bared like a cornered street dog, twisting and kicking his feet in midair as he tried to break the Kingsguard knight's iron grip. It was an entirely pathetic, futile effort. Sir Humphrey barely registered the boy's thrashing, reaching over with his free hand to pluck the stolen coin pouch from the kid's dirty fingers. "What should be done with him, my prince?" Sir Humphrey asked, his voice flat and unbothered beneath his brown wool hood. "Cut off his hands, chop off his fingers, throw him into the Blackwater." Now, the future Maegor the Gentle inside my brain would have probably demanded the child's hands be served to him on a silver platter before breakfast. But while I thoroughly enjoyed LARPing as an unhinged, terrifying Dark Lord for my own personal entertainment, I was not a mindless, cartoonishly evil monster. Cutting off the hand of a kid over a pouch of coins in the middle of a muddy street was sloppy, unproductive, and completely devoid of vision. I folded my arms across my chest, leaning down to inspect the tiny thief with a severe frown. The boy's defiant scowl rapidly dissolved under my icy purple stare. His bravado shattered into terror as he took in my dark velvet doublet, the white knight standing over him, and the realization that he had just tried to rob royal blood. "What is your name, boy?" I demanded, my voice sharp and clear. The child swallowed hard, his dirty throat working as he weighed the option of lying versus surviving the next 5 minutes. "Pate, m'lord," he stammered, his thick flea-bottomed peasant accent slurred with desperate fear. "Just Pate, please, sweet young lord, don't kill me. I only done it 'cause me belly is flappin' against me spine, it is. Ain't had a proper bite of bread in 2 days, I swear it by the 7. Me is just an orphan, m'lord, living in the alleys under the hill." I stared at Pate for a long, silent beat, tapping my chin thoughtfully with my index finger. My initial instinct was to simply tell Sir Humphrey to cuff the kid on the ear, toss him back into the mud, and let us get on with our morning stroll. The kid meant nothing to me, after all. But just as I opened my mouth to dismiss him, a brilliant, electrifying spark of inspiration detonated inside my brain like a keg of wildfire. A eureka moment, if you will. I snapped my fingers loudly, a slow, scheming grin spreading across my face as I raised a silver gold eyebrow at the trembling orphan. "Tell me, Pate," I asked, tilting my head, "what would you say if I offered you regular, honest work that paid real, shiny coin?" Pate's dirty brow furrowed in immediate, deep-seated peasant distrust. His eyes flickered nervously between my expensive clothes and Sir Humphrey's ominous, hooded form. He had lived on the streets long enough to know that high-born lords rarely offered dirty street rats anything other than a horsewhip or a hanging rope. To shatter his skepticism and drive my point home, I reached into my inner coat pocket, pulled out a heavy, gleaming gold dragon, and held it up between my thumb and forefinger. The bright afternoon sunlight caught the polished yellow metal, causing the three-headed dragon stamped on its face to flash like a miniature sun. Pate literally trembled where he stood. His jaw dropped so low I thought it might detach from his skull, his filthy brown eyes locked onto the gold coin with a terrifying, hypnotic intensity. Now, I was well aware that Georgie's understanding of medieval monetary economics was wildly inconsistent in his books, but in the practical reality of 17th year after the conquest Westeros, a single gold dragon was a life-changing fortune for a flea-bottomed street rat. That single coin could buy enough stale bread, salted pork, and cheap ale to feed an entire alleyway of beggars for half a year. Pate had likely never seen real gold in his entire miserable existence. He swallowed a lump of dry spit, his eyes bulging as he stared at the gold. Fine, sweet lord, but what sort of work would a highborn want from a muddy cur like me? Now, even you can easily guess where my brain was heading with this little experiment. In the far-off future, a cunning spymaster named Varys would build a legendary, terrifying intelligence network across the Seven Kingdoms using mute, literate orphans he affectionately called his little birds. Varys understood a fundamental truth of human society: nobody pays the slightest bit of attention to street children. Highborn lords, drunk knights, corrupt merchants, and plotting handmaidens constantly blabbed their darkest secrets in open taverns, private solars, and dark alleyways, completely ignoring the scruffy orphan boy sweeping the hearth or begging for crusts nearby. Granted, my primitive prototype ring would not have the luxury of secret passages beneath the Red Keep, but starting early was a massive strategic advantage. If Pate proved useless or ran off with my money, I lost virtually nothing. If it worked, I gained an eyes and ears network in the lower city before I even reached my 6th name day. I need you to listen to people for me, I said softly, stepping closer so my voice did not carry down the street. I want you to keep your ears open in the taverns, the docks, and the markets. Listen to what the highborn knights, foreign merchants, and loud captains talk about when they think no one is paying attention. Bring me anything interesting: gossip, royal complaints, rumors of rebellion, cheating merchants, or secret meetings. The more damaging it is to their reputation, the better. I tossed the golden dragon an inch into the air and caught it cleanly in my palm, Pate's wide eyes following the arc of the yellow metal like a starved cat watching a sparrow. The better the information you bring me, the more gold you and your friends will earn, I continued smoothly. Does that sound fair to you, boy? Pate nodded frantically, his dirty head bobbing up and down like a wooden buoy in a storm, his eyes completely mesmerized by my hand. I paused for a moment, my dark eyes narrowing as I reconsidered my options. Handing a gold dragon to an 8-year-old street thief right now was a monumentally stupid idea. The moment Sir Humphrey let go of his arm, the kid would bolt down the nearest alleyway, buy 20 meat pies, and give me the finger. I am going to give you 1 week, I said, slipping the golden dragon back into my tunic pocket and reaching into my coin pouch instead. I pulled out a heavy, gleaming silver stag and flipped it through the air. Pate caught the silver coin with cat-like reflexes, clutching it tightly to his chest as though it were his own newborn child. That silver stag is a token of my trust, I warned him, my voice dropping into a low, icy tone that sent a visible shiver down his spine. Take as many trustworthy orphan boys as you need. Gather real, useful information, and meet me beside the stone fountain near the docks 7 days from today. If you bring me good gossip, you will all get gold. But if you try to lie to me, make up fake stories, or take my silver and run away. I stepped in close, staring directly into his soul with my purple eyes. Remember this, Pate, I am a prince. I have a very long memory, and I never, ever forgive a grievance. Now, was terrifying a kid fun? I would say yes, usually. But when the child was a random street urchin rather than some pompous lordling, it wasn't as fun. The sharp threat hit its mark perfectly. Pate turned pale beneath his layer of street soot, nodding with intense, terrified determination. Why yes, m'lord, I swear it on me mother's grave. Me and the boys will listen to every blabbering mouth from here to the river. You'll get your secrets, sweet prince. I gave Sir Humphrey a curt nod. The Kingsguard knight released the boy's wrist. Pate did not waste a single millisecond. He turned on his heel, tucked the silver stag deep into his rags, offered me a hilarious, clumsy little bow, and scampered off down the muddy alleyway, disappearing into the dense crowd like a shadow. Sir Humphrey stared at the empty space where the boy had been standing, letting out a soft, skeptical grunt beneath his hood. He is never going to return, my prince. You just traded a fine silver stag for a street rat's empty promise. I shrugged my broad shoulders, completely unfazed as I adjusted my wool mantle. At the end of the day, Sir, it matters very little to me. It was 1 silver stag. If he runs off, I have not lost much. If he actually returns with useful intelligence, I have purchased my very first spy ring for pennies on the dragon. Low risk, high reward. Sir Humphrey shook his armored head in disbelief, but fell into step behind my shoulder as I turned back toward the lower thoroughfares. "Where to now, Prince Maegor?" he asked. "I want to inspect the docks down along the Blackwater," I declared cheerfully. Sir Humphrey paused in his tracks, casting a dark look toward the western horizon. The sun was already beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds over the distant reach in brilliant streaks of orange, violet, and dark crimson. "The sun will be setting soon, my prince," the White Knight warned sternly. "The docklands become a lawless hive of drunks, cutthroats, and press gangs once twilight falls. Making haste back to the safety of the fort is the need of the hour." I turned my head slightly, throwing him a smirk as I slipped deftly through a narrow gap between two fat merchants carrying wool sacks. "What is the matter, Sir Humphrey? Do you doubt your own ability to protect a 5-year-old boy?" Sir Humphrey choked on his own spit, letting out a sharp, raspy cough into his leather gauntlet. He opened his mouth to deliver a stern royal lecture, but realized I was already 10 paces ahead of him, weaving through the crowded street with purpose. Suppressing a heavy sigh, the Kingsguard knight tightened his tattered brown coat over his armor and hurried after me. When was the last time I had enjoyed myself this much? It was hard to recall. While beating up snobbish, arrogant kids in the training yard was fun in its own right, verbally annoying a deadly, stone-faced Kingsguard knight was infinitely more rewarding. As we descended the final sloping ridge of the hill, the muddy track gave way to the bustling, timber-planked avenues of the Blackwater docklands. The sheer, overwhelming scale of maritime commerce was a staggering sight to behold. The riverfront was a chaotic, sprawling labyrinth of rickety wooden piers, heavy timber wharves, crane winches, and stone warehouses stretching for a mile along the dark water. The ambient air here was a potent, thick cocktail of smells: salt spray, wet oak, rotting fish, burning pine tar, sea coal smoke, and cheap SOC rum. Hundreds of ships of every conceivable shape and size were moored along the riverbank or anchored out in the deep channel. I spotted massive, belly-timbered trading cogs from the free cities of Pentos, Tirosh, and Mur, their tall pine masts bristling against the twilight sky like a wooden forest. Beside them sat sleek, long-hulled trading galleys from the Vale, flat-bottomed grain barges down from the Reach, and salt-crusted fishing smacks from the Crownlands. One vessel in particular caught my keen eye, a magnificent, long-hulled war galley riding high near the central stone pier, flying a brilliant pale green banner emblazoned with a silver seahorse. House Velaryon of Driftmark. The sight of Lord Velarion's flagship reminded me of the maritime power of old Valyria, but I couldn't help but wonder what the ship was doing here. The Velaryons had ruled the tides long before my ancestors had set a foot on Westeros, controlling the trade routes across the Blackwater Bay with their fleet. The noise along the wharves was deafening. Muscle-bound dock porters, stripped to the waist and dripping with sweat, carried heavy wooden crates of Tyroshi dyes, Pentoshi silks, and Myrish glass off the ships, grunting in unison as they hauled their loads up the timber ramps. Foreign merchants shouted prices in colorful, musical dialects of High Valyrian and Bastard Valyrian, while local Westerosi fishwives screamed at the top of their lungs, hawking fresh oysters, salt cod, and eels from wooden buckets. I strolled down the timber pier, taking in the grand spectacle with interest. Seeing so many different people was definitely interesting. As the last rays of golden sunlight dipped behind the horizon, casting deep purple shadows across the bay, my stomach let out a loud, thunderous rumble that echoed even above the noise of the docks. All that walking, sword practice, and spy recruiting had burned through my morning breakfast entirely. Spotting a small stone hearth set up near the edge of the pier, where an old, bent fishmonger woman was frying fresh river fish and spiced sausage links over glowing coals in a heavy iron skillet, my eyes lit up. The sizzling lard smelled absolutely divine, perfumed with wild garlic, crushed black pepper, and sea salt. I marched over to the hearth, pulled 2 shiny silver stags from my pouch, and slapped them onto the wooden counter. 2 of your finest sausage rolls, good woman. Extra garlic, and make sure the meat is thoroughly cooked through. The old woman blinked in surprise at the sight of shiny silver, quickly wrapping 2 fat, sizzling pork sausages inside thick, toasted barley flatbreads with a pair of wooden tongs. She handed them over with a toothless, beaming smile. I took a massive, blistering bite out of my sausage roll. It was incredibly delicious and I almost groaned at the good taste. Man, I sure hope it wasn't made out of rat meat, or worse, human meat. If it was, then there was a first time for everything right. Turning around, I thrust the second sausage roll directly into Sir Humphrey's leather-gloved hand. The Kingsguard knight looked down at the piping hot street food as though I had handed him a live venomous viper. My prince, I am on duty. I cannot eat street rations while guarding royal blood. Eat the sausage, Sir Humphrey, I ordered with a shrug, taking another bite. If I was eating human meat, then he would do it as well with me. That is a royal command. You have been staring at stone walls and tracking me. The least you can do is enjoy a hot meal before we climb that godforsaken hill again. Sir Humphrey hesitated, glancing down at the sizzling flatbread, before lifting his brown wool hood slightly and taking a cautious bite. His dark eyes widened in subtle appreciation as he chewed the savory pork. "It is palatable, Prince Maegor," he admitted softly. "See, life is far too short to eat boring castle broth every night," I chuckled, wiping a speck of grease from my chin with the back of my sleeve. With the stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky above, we turned away from the noisy, lanternlit docks and began our slow, peaceful trek back up the grassy slopes of Aegon's Hill. The cold sea wind whipped through my dark wool mantle, but the hot sausage in my belly and the heavy velvet doublet kept me thoroughly warm. As we approached the towering pine gates of the Aegon fort, where the torch flames flickered against the twilight, I looked back one last time at the sprawling, lanternlit settlement below. It had been an interesting morning out in the world and I felt like I had done a decent amount of good work. The road to becoming a legendary dictator was going to be long, violent, and chaotic. But as I stepped through the castle gates and heard the heavy iron bolts slide into place behind me, I knew one thing with absolute, unshakable certainty. I was going to enjoy every single second of it. First things first, I was going to have a beautiful time sleeping on my soft bed. Remember kids, you don't become a dictator by skipping your important sleep. Was dictator even the correct term? Well, it didn't matter anyways. Chapter 12. The faith of the Seven was an interesting religion. I leaned back in my heavy oak chair, flipping through the thick, yellowed parchment pages of their holy book, the Seven-Pointed Star. My thumb and forefinger rubbed at my chin in deep thought as I scanned the illuminated script inked in golden indigo. Normally, I would not waste a single second reading the ramblings of religious zealots, but when you are trying to conquer and hold a realm, it is always a good idea to study the doctrines of your future enemies. Know thy enemy, know their bullshit, and all that crap. The core philosophy of the faith was simple enough on the surface: God is one divine being with 7 faces. Humanity was allegedly forged in that divine image, which meant that every living soul in Westeros, from a high-born king sitting on a throne of melted swords down to a filthy pig farmer knee-deep in mud, contained a tiny spark of all 7 aspects. According to the Septons, to abuse or mistreat a commoner was to deface a living temple of the 7. That was an interesting little piece of theological rhetoric. It was clearly designed to uplift the miserable masses, give the small folk a sense of spiritual dignity, and keep the regional warlords from slaughtering their peasant labor force on a whim. Naturally, it did absolutely nothing for me. Anything that gave the small folk big ideas about human rights or encouraged them to become literate was a direct threat to my absolute, royal reign. A literate peasant is a peasant who starts asking questions about taxes, land ownership, and why a 5-year-old kid gets to ride a massive fire-breathing dragon while they eat turnip soup. The book went on to proclaim that the faith believed in the ultimate equality of all souls beneath the heavens. For this noble reason, the 7 that are one had bestowed upon mankind their 7 divine amendments, a set of holy laws meant to be carved into the heart of every true believer. I cleared my throat, leaning over the heavy leather-bound tome to read the formal passages inked upon the sheepskin. The First Amendment, the law of scales. Power is a sacred duty, not a birthright of blood. Justice that favors the high-born lord over the low-born beggar is an abomination in the sight of the heavens. The Father sits in judgment above all earthly thrones, holding the golden scales of equity, and those who wield authority with cruelty shall find their own crowns weighed and found wanting. The Second Amendment, the law of the open hearth. No child of the realm shall starve while a lord's granary sits full. The mother spreads her loving arms over the weak, the orphan, and the destitute, to hoard the fruits of the earth while thy neighbor perishes in the winter snow is to invite the blight upon thy fields and the rot upon thy bone. The Third Amendment, the law of the anvil. Honest labor is holy in the eyes of God. To deny a worker their fair wages or to grind the faces of the poor into the dust is to spit upon the altar of the smith. Every hammer stroke, every plowed furrow, and every stitched seam is a prayer uttered in iron and earth. The Fourth Amendment, the law of the shield. A sword drawn against the defenseless is an instrument of treason against heaven. The warrior lends his strength to the weak, not the tyrant. He who uses his steel to oppress the widow or slay the innocent shall find his blade shattered and his shield turned to ash when the battle comes. The Fifth Amendment, the law of the unlit candle. Wisdom belongs to all the children of the earth, knowledge kept in darkness rots the soul. The crone lifts her glowing lantern to guide the lost through the shadow, and those who hide the truth or burn the scrolls of knowledge shall wander forever in blind darkness. The Sixth Amendment, the law of the unblemished flower. Every individual possesses absolute sovereignty over their own flesh, no consent, no union. The maiden protects the purity of the heart and the sanctity of the body. Any act of violence, forced marriage, or unwanted touch is a grave sin that stains the soul with ink that cannot be washed clean. The Seventh Amendment, the law of the black cloak. In the quiet darkness of the grave, the king's golden crown and the beggar's ragged tunic rot together in the same cold mud. The stranger claims all men in their appointed hour, holding no favor for wealth, bloodline, or title. Before the final threshold, all mortals stand equal and bare. I ignored the rest of the archaic jargon, flipping rapidly through the remaining pages filled with flowery hymns and dramatic illustrations. Honestly, it was all surprisingly respectable shit that you would expect from a mainstream medieval religion. It was a brilliantly designed social construct made to appease, control, and protect the masses while giving them a basic moral framework so they wouldn't murder each other in the streets every night. On top of the main amendments, there were hundreds of lesser edicts and moral decrees. Do not commit murder, do not bear false witness against your neighbor, respect your elders, give alms to the poor, and never commit the foul sin of incest. Follow all these rules dutifully, and the Septons promised you entry into the 7 sections of heaven. There, your immortal soul would spend eternity resting in crystal palaces, drinking sweet arbor wine, and reuniting with your loved ones in a paradise where disease, winter, famine, and unhappiness did not exist. Naturally, each of the 7 sections was grander than the last, and your placement depended entirely on the total amount of good deeds you logged during your earthly life. It appealed to the human sense of materialism and the desperate hope for something better after death with absolute perfection. And of course, if you were a bad boy, there were the 7 layers of hell. Break the holy laws, and your soul would be dragged down into pits of howling wildfire, icy wastes, or swarms of biting maggots, burning for 10,000 years depending on the exact severity of your earthly sins. Now, I could sit here and go on and on about the hypocrisy of religion like a 14-year-old asshole kid who had just discovered edgy internet atheism, but I'd rather not waste my breath. I was never a person who cared too much for high-minded moral debates or spiritual philosophy. You see, in my opinion, this religion was actually pretty great. It had the absolute perfect mix of existential suffering, tangible rewards, divine punishment, and psychological control to keep the unwashed masses in line and force them to act somewhat civilized. It was practically tailor-made for a grim, violent, medieval shithole like Westeros. Had my personal circumstances been different, I might have even become its biggest advocate, funding new seps and handing out copies of the 7-pointed star to every peasant in the Crownlands. But I won't do that. You wanna know why? It comes down to one very simple, non-negotiable detail at the end of the day. This religion won't let me fuck my sisters, my nieces, my aunts, or my mother. A completely valid and reasonable deal-breaker in my opinion. As a proper Valyrian dragon prince, keeping the bloodline pure and preserving the dragon-riding genetics was top priority. And anything that stood in direct opposition to this core value of mine, well, it was going to need to be utterly dismantled and destroyed when I came of age. Overall, though, the faith of the 7 was kind of a goofy, obsessive religion in its own special way, mostly because of how their holy logic functioned. Literally everything you could think of, from grand religious festivals and sacred holy days down to formal ceremonies, vows, and legal edicts, either contained the number 7 or was strictly divisible by 7. 7 altars, 7 holy oils, 7 colors of the rainbow prism, 7 hells, 7 heavens, 7 vows. I don't know why, but the thought of some ancient, bearded septon sitting in a dark, cold stone cell in Aldtown spending hundreds of hours sweating over a scroll just to make sure every single holy rule fit perfectly into the number 7 was hilariously absurd to me. Letting out a wide, exhausted yawn, I slammed the heavy, leather-bound book shut with a loud, echoey that rattled the wooden table, stretching my broad 5-year-old arms high above my head. And so, my young princes, we must remember that the customs and sacred practices of the 7 are the very glue holding the realm together, the old septon stammered, his raspy voice cutting off as his bushy gray eyebrows furrowed in utter shock. He stared at me as I casually stood up from my chair and began rolling my shoulders to stretch my tight muscles. Prince Maegor, the old man blinked, his sagging cheeks quivering with indignation. Where are you going? The lecture has not ended yet. We still have 3 hours of scripture to cover. It has been an immensely fascinating lecture, truly, Septon, but I have now become thoroughly bored, I said, letting out another theatrical yawn as I cast a sideways glance at my brother Aenys. My older brother was sitting at the adjacent wooden desk, holding a quill in his skinny, pale hand, looking between me and the Septon with absolute, sweating anxiety painted across his delicate face. Aenys looked like he was about to have a panic attack on my behalf, terrified that the gods were going to strike me down with lightning right then and there. Be but my prince, the old Septon sputtered, his frail hands trembling as he clutched a crystal hanging from his neck. This is your very first official lecture on the holy texts. I casually waved the old man off with a flick of my wrist, taking a slow step toward the heavy oak door of the solar. You know, I mused aloud, turning my head to throw him a bright, mischievous grin, if the starry sept of Aldtown actually cares about retaining the attention of young dragon princes, they really should send someone far prettier than you. Without waiting for his horrified response, I pulled the heavy door open, stepped out into the quiet stone corridor, and shut the oak door firmly behind me, leaving the septon gasping for air and poor Aenys sweating bullets in the solar. That had indeed been my very first, and almost certainly my last, formal lecture with a septon. My mother, Queen Visenya, had strictly forbidden the maesters of the citadel and the holy men of the faith from meddling in my education. She was fiercely paranoid that those grey sheep and religious zealots would try to poison my mind with weak, anti-Valerian propaganda, which suited me just fine. I had only tagged along today out of pure, bored curiosity, joining Aeneas in his daily religious studies to see what all the fuss was about. Turns out it was mostly dry babble, though reading their holy book myself had been a somewhat enlightening exercise in geopolitical analysis. Besides, anyone with half a modern brain knows that if you want to successfully brainwash or manipulate a highborn royal heir, you send a young, gorgeous honey trap, not a decrepit, 80-year-old man who looks like he is constructed entirely out of sagging skin and dry bones. If the faith of R'hllor had sent Melisandre to King's Landing instead of a drunk Thoros of Myr, Bobby B would have converted the entire Seven Kingdoms from the faith of the Seven to the Lord of Light within a single fortnight. The people of this medieval world were truly terrible at basic royal espionage and political seduction. My boots clicked softly against the cold flagstones as I wandered aimlessly through the winding, torchlit hallways of the Eggenfort. Eventually, my feet led me toward a small, secluded open-air courtyard tucked away in the eastern wing of the fortress. It was a quiet, breathtaking little garden, far prettier and more tranquil than one would ever expect to find inside a wooden and stone military stronghold. If my historical memory served me correctly, King Aegon had originally ordered this garden built for his younger sister-wife, Queen Rhaenys, who loved sweet flowers, music, and poetry. But Rhaenys was dead now, her dragon Merryxes shot down over the sands of Hellholt in Dorne years ago, and barely anyone visited this lonely corner of the fort anymore. Yet, despite his deep, silent grief, my father had made sure the garden never fell into neglect or disrepair. The stone paths were swept clean, the hedges were neatly trimmed, and the vibrant flower beds were flourishing under the pale moonlight. Red roses, night-blooming jasmine, and sweet winter lilies scented the cool sea breeze blowing off the bay, their colorful petals glowing under the silvery night sky. I walked slowly down the gravel path, admiring the quiet beauty of the place, when I suddenly froze mid-step. Lying in the dark, cool shadow beneath a sculpted stone bench was a shape. It was a cat, not just any cat, mind you, but an absolute unit of a black tomcat. A vast, spherical void of fur resting peacefully on the smooth grass, its belly rising and falling in rhythmic sleep. A slow, devious grin spread across my face in the moonlight. You know exactly what time it is. Hee hee hee. Dropping into a low, stealthy crouch, I initiated tactical crawl mode. I crept forward inch by inch across the dukest grass, making sure not to snap a single twig or rustle a single leaf, carefully closing the distance until my broad 5-year-old hands were within striking range of the sleeping beast. With a sudden, decisive burst of speed, I lunged forward and scooped the massive black cat right off the turf, pinning him securely against my chest. To my complete surprise, the cat did not scratch my eyes out, hiss, or panic. It simply opened one lazy, golden eye, looked at my silver hair, let out a tiny, unbothered squeak, and went right back to relaxing in my arms. Damn, what an absolute, unbothered fat bastard. This guy truly did not have a single care in the entire world. I sat down right there in the damp grass, resting the massive black unit across my lap, and began aggressively scratching him right under the chin and behind his folded ears. The moment my fingers touched his neck, the cat started his engine. A loud, rumbling, continuous purr vibrated through his thick fur, sounding like a tiny diesel engine running on full throttle inside his belly. How in the world could a street cat even get this amazingly fat in a medieval setting? I would have thought such a creature was a biological impossibility in this era, considering that even wealthy highborn lords rarely grew fat until they reached middle age and spent decades drinking heavy Arbor Gold. This magnificent void must have been living like a king, feasting on discarded scraps of roasted duck and fat river rats from the royal kitchens every single night. As I scratched his belly, a funny thought struck my modern mind. Weren't there famous rumors recorded by Citadel historians in the future claiming that young Prince Maegor was a cruel, bloodthirsty sadist who spent his childhood torturing small animals and skinning nursery cats? I chuckled softly to myself, watching the fat tomcat roll over onto his back in complete, blissful submission, stretching his paws into the air as I rubbed his soft tummy. Maybe this was how those absurd historical rumors originally got started. A bitter maester probably saw me holding a cat in the shadows and decided to write down that I was eating it raw. Then again, the original child Maegor probably wasn't a cartoonishly evil monster either, just a tough, quiet kid who grew up under the heavy shadow of his legendary father and a ruthless mother. If those exaggerated propaganda rumors managed to stick to my reputation in this lifetime as well, I doubted I would care very much. Fear was an exceptionally useful tool for a ruler, after all. I froze in the damp grass, my hand resting on his soft black belly. The faint, rhythmic crunch of boots stepping onto the gravel path echoed softly through the quiet night air. Someone was walking toward me in the shadows. Chapter 13. Turning slowly on the damp grass, I squinted into the dark canopy of the garden. A silhouette was gliding through the gloom beneath the weirwood carved archway. Man, at this point I should really just get a blade strapped to my belt at all times. Who knew how many stealthy assassins, political rivals, or unhinged zealots were going to be creeping around me at all hours of the night, itching to put 6 inches of steel into my 5-year-old spine. Please don't do that, folks, I thoroughly enjoy being alive. Still, as the stranger paused beneath the fluttering leaves of an old oak tree, they seemed just as startled as I was. Their figure remained completely frozen in the ink-black shade. I frowned, my modern tactical brain assessing the security situation. Where the hell were the guards? Shouldn't there have been at least 2 armed men posted at the garden entrance when I came in here? That lapse in royal security led me to believe the intruder wasn't here to slit my throat. Besides, based on their outline against the moonlit fountain, we were roughly the same height and build, which meant if things came down to a brawl in the dirt, I could easily beat them to a pulp with my freakishly dense toddler muscles. Who goes there? I demanded, pitching my voice low and firm. My sudden call-out startled the shadow even further. The figure flinched, stepping backward before halting entirely. For an agonizing second, nobody moved. Then, the intruder stepped out of the tree's dark shade, letting the soft silver light of the full moon bathe her face. It was a girl, and not just any random kitchen servant, either. She had pale silver-gold hair that fell in silky waves down her back, catching the moonlight like liquid starlight. Her eyes were deep, striking amethysts, set above high, aristocratic cheekbones. Her face was sharp, noble, and distinctly feminine. For one bizarre, horrifying second, I almost wondered if my brother Aenys had suddenly thrown on a gown to go prancing through the garden at midnight, but a second look dispelled that hilarious nightmare. There were clear, obvious differences between them. Her jaw was delicate, her nose fine-drawn, her demeanor far more composed. Still, if it wasn't Aenys, who the hell was she? I racked my brain, searching through my mental encyclopedia of A Song of Ice and Fire lore for every high-born silver-haired lady who should be hanging around King's Landing during this exact period of time. It is Alyssa, Alyssa Velaryon, the girl answered, her voice soft and melodious, carrying a subtle, nervous tremble as she stood under the moonlight. A beat passed, and then she dipped into a flawless, graceful curtsy, smoothing the skirts of her fine sea-green silk dress. Yet beneath her aristocratic posture, there was a clear air of hesitation, her dark purple eyes watching me with cautious curiosity. I hummed softly, rubbing my chin in deep thought while my hand remained resting on the fat black cat sleeping in my lap. Alyssa Velaryon, daughter of Lord Ethan Velaryon, future wife of my weakling brother Aenys, future queen of the 7 kingdoms, and the exact woman who would work directly against me in the future, bearing the children who would eventually usurp my throne and cause me a world of political headaches. To be entirely honest, the thought of pulling a preemptive strike and eliminating everyone standing in my path to total royal ascension had crossed my mind more than once. Clean, efficient, no civil wars later. But for now, I hadn't taken any of those dark thoughts too seriously. I wasn't a cartoonish villain, after all. Still, seeing the future mother of my rival house standing 5 feet away from me in a moonlit garden made me realize I probably needed to start formulating serious contingency plans. "Are you, Prince Aenys?" Alyssa asked, drawing me out of my dark, scheming thoughts. A sudden, uncontrollable burst of laughter escaped my throat. The sheer irony of someone comparing me to my frail, sickly brother was just too damn funny. I caught myself quickly, seeing the young Velaryon girl flinch and turn visibly awkward at my sudden outburst. "No," I replied, smoothing my face into a friendly smile as I gestured to the empty space on the damp grass beside me. "I am his younger brother, Maegor. Come, take a seat." An uncertain, hesitant look flickered across her pale face, but she slowly walked over, gathering her fine silk skirts and sinking gracefully down onto the lawn next to me. "Prince Maegor." Alyssa tilted her head, her deep amethyst eyes scanning my broad shoulders, thick arms, and heavy frame with genuine bewilderment. "Forgive me, my prince, but shouldn't you be a lot smaller?" The moment the words left her lips, she winced hard, realizing her breach of royal etiquette. Her hands flew up in a frantic, apologetic gesture, her cheeks flushing a pale rose in the moonlight. "I did not mean any offense, my prince. Please, forgive my foolish tongue, I only meant." I waved off her frantic worries with a light hand, watching her let out a long, audible sigh of relief. Leaning back against the stone bench, I let the rough granite dig comfortably into my back. "Do not fret, Lady Alyssa. I do not mind such small offenses," I said smoothly. Truthfully, my tolerance for disrespect usually depended on whether the person was an annoying, snobbish courtier or a pretty girl. Since she fell squarely into the latter category, and since I had zero interest in making a 10-year-old child cry in a dark garden, I decided to be an absolute gentleman. "Tell me, what brings a daughter of Driftmark out near the middle of the night?" I asked. Besides, the colossal black tomcat in my lap decided to wake up. It let out a low, gravelly groan, rolled onto its side, and attempted to lick its own massive, fat belly. It reached for 2 seconds, realized its belly was far too rotund for its tongue to reach, gave up completely, and flopped back onto the grass with an embarrassed grunt. The hilarious display instantly caught Alyssa's attention. Her eyes widened with warm recognition as she looked at the cat. "I arrived at the fort only this evening with my lord father," she explained, her voice softening as she held out a pale hand toward the lazy feline, trying to coax it closer. The cat ignored her completely. "After supper, I went to explore the lower courtyards. I spotted this cat wandering near the kitchens earlier, and I thought, well, I was hoping I might find him again so I could feed him." "Feed him?" I exclaimed, staring down at the absolute sphere of black fur in utter disbelief. "This fat bastard does not need to be fed another bite for the rest of the leap year. He is already built like a siege engine." Alyssa folded her small, delicate hands over her silken lap, a deep crimson blush dusting her cheeks as she looked down at the grass, muttering in a quiet, adorable voice. "I had nothing better to do, my prince." I scratched my cheek, watching the fat cat finally push its heavy body off the ground. It stretched its front legs, shook its thick fur, and began pacing in a slow circle, inspecting its surroundings like an emperor reviewing his troops. For a brief second, I pondered the idea of picking up the fat unit and taking him back to my personal bedchambers. But I quickly shut that idea down. My daily schedule was already packed with heavy weapons training, military strategy, modern engineering concepts, and dodging religious lectures. Taking care of a high-maintenance, overweight feline sounded like an unnecessary administrative headache. Though, now that I thought about it, wasn't it absurdly weird for a 5-year-old toddler to have a packed executive calendar? Whatever, I wasn't a real 5-year-old anyway. "My lord father told me that the king is searching for potential brides for his eldest son," Alyssa shared quietly, her fingers wringing the silk of her dress in her lap as she stared up at the vast, starry sky. I rubbed my jaw, wondering why she was dumping such heavy political marriage talk on a 5-year-old boy. Modern child psychology probably had an answer for it. The poor girl was 10 years old, shipped off from her island home of Driftmark to a chaotic royal fort full of strangers, terrifying dragons, and stoic guards. She was anxious, lonely, and looking for a friend. I just happened to be the first approachable person she ran into who didn't talk down to her like an infant or treat her like a political bargaining chip. I looked up at the glowing silver moon hanging above the towers of the Egenfort. If my mental timeline was accurate, Alyssa was around 10 years of age, making her the exact same age as my brother Aenys. Her father, Lord Ethan Velaryon, was the current master of ships and lord of the tides. Ethan was a damn cool name, honestly. It was a shame history didn't feature more lords named Ethan. What is Prince Aenys like?" Alyssa finally asked, turning her head to look directly into my eyes. Her purple gaze was filled with genuine vulnerability and a silent plea for honesty. "You are his brother, you should know him well, right?" Before I could answer, the fat black cat finished its perimeter sweep. It trotted over to where I sat, its thick tail sticking straight up in the air like a ship's mast, staring at my lap with demanding golden eyes. Without an ounce of shame, the fat, unemployed freeloading beast leapt up, landing with a heavy, thudding impact right across my thighs, settling its dense, meaty bulk into my lap once again. Now, if this were any other wild animal in the Kingswood, a majestic stag or a royal falcon, I would have been bragging to myself about being a male Disney princess with magical beastmaster powers. But looking down at this manipulative, overweight stray, I knew with absolute certainty that this affection was a cold, calculated strategy to extort food out of me. Even now, as it rested its heavy chin on my knee, its wide golden eyes stared up at me with fake, weaponized innocence. "Aenys," I said, stroking the cat's thick fur while looking back into Alyssa's eyes. As I spoke, I noticed she had leaned in quite close to me, close enough that I could catch the faint, lovely scent of crushed sea pinks and sweet lavender wafting off her silk dress. "To be completely honest with you, I do not know him all that well," I admitted candidly. "We rarely speak at length. I spend a decent amount of my time at Dragonstone training with my mother, and when I am here at the Egenfort, he is usually off riding in royal processions alongside our father." The fat cat in my lap pawed aggressively at my wool trousers, letting out a pitiful, heartbreaking meow as if it hadn't eaten in 3 weeks. "Nice try, buddy, not happening. He is a good person, I suppose," I continued, giving Alyssa a fair, objective assessment. "He gets along far better with ladies and court singers than he does with boys his own age. The courtiers and lords love him because he is gentle, polite, obedient, and never causes a scene. He admires me to a certain extent, though he mostly tries to copy my training routines and fails because his constitution is delicate. That is about the sum of him." Alyssa pulled back slightly, the soft curve of her pink lips turning downward into a contemplative frown as she absorbed my words. She fell into a quiet, thoughtful silence, her eyes tracking the movement of my hand on the cat's back. "Right," she murmured softly, shaking her head as if clearing her mind. It almost slipped my mind entirely. Reaching into a small leather satchel resting on the grass beside her, she pulled out a carefully wrapped linen napkin. Unfolding it, she revealed 3 thick, juicy scraps of roasted capon and salt beef saved directly from the royal feast. She placed the napkin on the flat stone in front of us. The moment the scent of roasted meat hit the cat's nose, the fat bastard abandoned my lap without an ounce of loyalty. He leapt down so fast he nearly tripped over his own paws, burying his face into the napkin and devouring the capon with frantic, noisy gulps. I shook my head in utter disgust at his shameless antics. Unbelievable. How many noble ladies is this feline tricking on a daily basis just to secure free meat? What a manipulative bastard. Alyssa let out a sudden, musical giggle, covering her mouth with her delicate hand as her purple eyes sparkled with genuine amusement. How about you take this cat with you to your guest quarters? I suggested, raising an eyebrow at her. Alyssa looked up with a surprised look on her face before looking back at the cat, who had devoured the food in a matter of seconds. I don't see why not, she said, her eyes shining with subtle excitement. Standing up from the damp grass, I bent down and scooped the satisfied, heavy tomcat into my arms. The fat beast tried to struggle for a brief second before realizing it was entirely useless against my grip, giving up completely and hanging limply over my forearm like a heavy sack of grain. I'll drop him off for you, I said, gesturing toward the archway. Alyssa paused for a second, biting her lower lip in worry as she looked at me. Will it be all right for you to do so, being a prince? I responded with a simple shrug, stepping onto the gravel path. No one really cares that much, and if they do, let me know. Truthfully, I hadn't beaten someone with my bare fists for quite a while now that I thought about it, and my knuckles were practically itching for an excuse. We stepped out of the moonlit garden and entered the high, torchlit corridors of the Eggenfort. The contrast between the cool, quiet garden and the interior of the fortress was stark. Pitchpine torches sputtered in iron sconces every 20 paces, casting long, dancing shadows across the heavy timber beams and rough stone walls. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, roasted meats, hot tallow candles, and old wool. We walked side by side in a comfortable, easy silence. Alyssa adjusted her pace to match mine, my heavy leather boots echoed with rhythmic, solid thuds. Every so often, a pair of household guards dressed in the dragon-embellished leather coats of House Targaryen would round a corridor corner. The moment their eyes fell upon us, they would freeze, snap to rigid attention, and press their backs against the wall, their eyes wide with awe and confusion as they watched Prince Maegor strolling casually past, carrying a massive fat cat like a lord carrying a sack of gold. Yes, world, behold my majestic black cat. You are very different from what I expected, Prince Maegor, Alyssa said softly, breaking the silence as we climbed a wide wooden staircase leading toward the upper guest apartments. Oh, I murmured, shifting the fat cat's weight in my arm. And what did the grand stories on Driftmark say about me? That I eat raw iron for breakfast and crush skullcaps for fun. To be honest, I doubted there were any of such rumors going around for now, because I tried not to annoy people whenever I could. Unless it involved beating someone up. That's a different case entirely. Alyssa let out another soft, melodic laugh, her cheeks dimpling pleasantly in the flickering torchlight. No, nothing so terrifying. But my father's sailors did say that Queen Visenia's youngest son was born with the spirit of an ancient Valyrian warlord. They said you were quiet, stern, and hated everyone at court. Well, sailors are notorious liars, I chuckled, turning down the eastern gallery corridor. I do not hate everyone at court. Only about 90% of them. The remaining 10% are tolerable enough. She looked at me sideways, a bright, playful sparkle dancing in her dark purple eyes. And which category do I fall into, my prince? You brought roast capon to a hungry cat and did not bore me with 3 hours of religious doctrine, I said, offering her a wide, confident grin. That easily puts you in the top tier of human beings I have met this week, Lady Alyssa. Her smile widened, genuine and radiant, lighting up her sharp, noble features. Man, history books really didn't do her justice. She wasn't just a political pawn or a future queen, she was sharp, charming, sweet, and possessed a quiet, resilient grace that made her stand out like a solitary gem among the political vultures of King's Landing. Absolute best girl material, no contest. If my idiot brother Aenys ended up messing this up in the future, I was going to throw him off the Red Keep wall myself. We stopped outside a heavy oak door near the end of the guest wing, where 2 Velaryon guardsmen wearing pale green surcoats over mail stood watch. The guards snapped to attention, bowing deeply as I approached. Here we are, I declared, stepping forward and carefully handing the fat, purring black cat over to Alyssa. She took the heavy feline into her arms, hugging his thick black body against her silk gown. The cat let out a content, lazy squeak, resting its fat head against her shoulder. Alyssa looked up at me, her cheeks flushing a deep, radiant crimson under the golden light of the hallway sconce. Her purple eyes shone with warmth and genuine gratitude as she looked down at me. Thank you, Prince Maegor, she murmured softly, her voice sweet and sincere. For the conversation, the escort, and for the cat. Think nothing of it, Lady Alyssa, I replied, giving her a smooth, gentlemanly bow of my head. If you ever find yourself bored by court politics again, you know where the garden is. She bit her lip, a shy, adorable smile playing on her lips before she offered me a final, elegant nod. Good night, my prince. She turned, stepped into her guest room, and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet corridor with her guards. What a productive day that had been. Time for some much-desired sleepy time. Ah, how I missed my bed already. Chapter 14. I brushed my teeth aggressively with my wooden bristle brush, scrubbing with enough furious enthusiasm to make sure not a single tooth was left untouched. Wait, hold on a second. A toothbrush in a brutal, medieval shithole like Westeros. Plot hole, call the lore police. Nah, not really. The humble toothbrush was easily one of my very first tactical inventions upon waking up in this world. Do you have any idea how much sheer, unholy agony a human feels when they have a rotten root festering in their jaw? But the local medical technology consists entirely of rusty iron pliers, boiling wine, and a maester offering to bleed you with leeches. Well, I don't know the exact feeling either, and I thoroughly intend to keep it that way. Ergo, toothbrush. For my daily toothpaste, I was using a finely crushed mixture of charred wood and sea salt. The charcoal provided a coarse mechanical abrasive to polish off plaque and absorb odor-causing muck, while the salt offered a mild antibacterial boost to stimulate the gums. It was cheap, simple, and readily available everywhere from Dragonstone to the slums of Flea Bottom. 2 parts charcoal to 1 part salt for the ultimate dentifrice ratio. The charcoal, of course, had to be ground down into a fine powder as smooth as wheat flour and then meticulously sifted through fine silk, lest any sharp, unground bits scratch my royal enamel. Setting aside the jar of paste, I scooped up a pewter cup brimming with sour red wine. Bottoms up, the tart liquid swished around my mouth as I gargled loudly. The sour wine served as an improvised antiseptic to kill off lingering mouth bacteria, though the acidic taste was enough to make a lesser toddler gag. At this point, however, my modern palate had grown fully accustomed to the medieval burn. Spitting the dark purple slurry out into the ceramic basin, I picked up a second cup filled with clean well water, rinsing my mouth thoroughly to wash away any remaining specks of black grit. Setting the cup down, I leaned over the washstand and caught my reflection in the polished bronze mirror hanging on the wall. My hair was kept short on the sides, though longer and windswept on top, falling in soft silver gold locks. My eyes burned as bright as polished amethysts under the morning sunlight filtering through the high narrow window. Looking at my ridiculously symmetrical, genetically blessed Valerian face gave me my mandatory daily ego boost before stepping out into the world. As I glanced down into the basin at the dark water, I let out a heavy sigh. Reaching into my leather breeches, I pulled out a few flat copper pennies and laid them neatly on the wooden side table. It was no easy task for the fort's lower servants to scrub out filthy washbasins every morning, so consider this a small hazard pay tip from Prince Maegor. Plumbing, oh, sweet indoor plumbing, how I miss your glorious ceramic embrace. Why did none of the self-insert protagonists in those web novels ever talk about the horrific reality of medieval sanitation? It was always dragons, war, and political scheming, completely skipping over the fact that kings were dropping their royal waste into wooden buckets. But, as always, we do not speak of the plumbing. Running a broad hand through my silver hair, I dusted off my tunic, smoothed down the heavy wool, and turned toward the chamber door. On my way past the bedside table, I paused, opened the small wooden drawer, pulled out a heavy steel throwing dart, and slipped it into my pocket. My recent late-night strolls had made me acutely aware of the constant need to carry a weapon at all times. I couldn't wait until I hit a proper growth spurt so I could strap an actual steel broadsword to my waist like a normal, functional warlord. Stepping out into the hall, I began the long trek toward the royal solar where I knew my mother was waiting for us to break our fast. With King Aegon out on his royal progress across the Riverlands, Visenya was left holding the realm together, making her far busier than usual. We barely had any quiet moments to sit together anymore. The Kingsguard knight posted outside my door this morning was not Sir Humphrey, unfortunately. It was a lower guardsman in a leather jack. That was fine for now, but building strong personal bonds with as many Kingsguard knights as possible was high on my long-term priority list. When the time came for political maneuvers, I needed the white swords to either back my play or at least remain strictly neutral, which was going to be a monumental task. Most of those iron-willed bastards wouldn't budge an inch from their sacred oaths, regardless of who was holding the torch, a rigid devotion to duty that I could strangely respect. Still, I offered the guard a crisp nod as I passed, stepping out into the winding stone corridors of the Eggenfort. It was bitterly cold this morning. The fort's walls were constructed from thick, dark river stone without proper insulation or modern tapestries to trap the heat, turning the hallways into drafty wind tunnels. The damp sea air blew straight off the bay, cutting right through heavy wool and making the stone feel like ice underfoot. Walking through the drafty halls reminded me of the long list of modern amenities I desperately needed to introduce to this world. Phase 1 was simple: make mountains of cold, hard cash. Simply relying on the royal treasury was a rookie mistake. A prince needed his own private wealth. There were a handful of simple modern inventions, distilled spirits, refined soap, glass mirrors, and advanced metallurgy, that could make me ultraric the moment I set up production. Being a dragon prince made it hilariously easy to advertise high-end wares to every wealthy lord in the 7 kingdoms. Phase 2 would be taking those absurd profits and pumping them directly into Dragonstone, my primary base of operations. The island fortress was sitting on a mountain of untapped economic and military potential, and once I turned that volcanic rock into an industrial powerhouse, kingdom building would be smooth sailing. What actually worried my brain was the distinct possibility that some scheming lord or citadel advisor would try to sabotage my plans before they took root. To prevent that, I needed to maintain a pristine relationship with both Aenys and my father. For the most part, Visenya could easily handle Aegon through strategic guilt trips and Valyrian charm, and Aenys was far too soft to ever say no to me. That left only the snobbish royal counselors and highborn lords, men I would need to keep a very close eye on when the time came. Soon enough, I arrived at the grand oak doors of the Queen's private solar. Knocking twice and waiting for her sharp call of permission, I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside without any royal fanfare. My mother was sitting at the far end of a long carved table, draped in a rich crimson gown trimmed with dark fox fur. Her long silver-gold hair hung loosely around her bare shoulders, devoid of its usual tight battle braids. Her piercing violet gaze turned toward me the moment my boots clicked against the floorboards. Sliding out a heavy oak chair across from her, I sat down and surveyed the morning spread. There were fresh oatcakes, salt butter, dark plums, roasted sausages, and a pitcher of watered wine. Without waiting for a servant to prompt me, I immediately began shoveling food into my mouth. Breakfast with Visenya was always a quiet, stoic affair, but there was a comfortable, silent warmth to it. You look, I paused mid-sentence, swallowing a massive chunk of crusty bread, much better with your hair down, mother. Visenya raised a single, delicate silver eyebrow at my sudden compliment, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching her lips. Oh, is that so, Maegor? I gave her a firm nod, shoving a smoked sausage down my throat. Then perhaps I shall wear it loose more often, she mused softly, her eyes lingering on me with quiet affection. Shaking my head up and down in solid approval, I continued my relentless assault on the breakfast tray before taking a deep swig of water. Silence settled over the table once more, natural and easy, as we were both inherently quiet, observant people. Only when every scrap of sausage and oatcake had vanished into my stomach did I sit back, gulping down the last drop of water before breaking the silence. Mother, I began, my voice dropping an octave as I brought up a question that had been occupying my thoughts for weeks: what do you actually know about blood magic? From my deep knowledge of ASOIAF lore, Visenya Targaryen was one of the few living souls in the world who might actually possess real, ancient Valyrian esoteric knowledge. Citadel historians would later spread dark rumors claiming I was a demonic monster birthed through my mother's dark sorcery, a claim I heavily doubted, but I wasn't about to have an existential crisis over medieval fake news. The question caught her completely off guard. Visenya leaned back in her high-backed chair, the delicate column of her pale neck flexing as her violet eyes narrowed into sharp slits. A heavy, dangerous stillness fell over the room as she stared directly into my soul. What made you ask such a thing, Maegor? She asked, her tone razor-sharp with sudden suspicion. Nothing in particular, I answered with a casual shrug, leaning my elbows on the wooden table to show I had nothing to hide. I have simply been pondering the old legends of our house recently. If anyone in this entire realm understands the truth of our bloodline's secrets, it is you. Visenya pursed her lips, her gaze flickering down to the polished oak table as she weighed my words. A long, tense moment stretched between us before she reached across the table. Her pale, ringed hands slid up to cradle my face delicately between her warm palms. Pulling me forward until I could feel the radiant heat rising off her skin, she stared into my eyes with an intensity that burned right through me. I do not know who planted such dangerous thoughts in your head, she whispered, her low, commanding voice barely above a breath, but sorcery is not a game for children, Maegor. It is a poison. Promise me, here and now, that you will never try to uncover those dark secrets on your own. The sheer, raw gravity in her voice was enough to make my modern soul sit up and take notice. I shall heed your advice, mother. You have my word, I said, offering her a slow, deliberate nod. Another tense second passed before the tight strain in her shoulders melted away. She leaned in close, pressing her soft lips firmly against my forehead, letting the kiss linger for a long moment before releasing my face and pulling back. There is a lot that I could teach you, she admitted softly, resting her chin on her hand as her loose silver hair fell across her shoulder. But, truthfully, Even after years of searching through ancient scrolls saved from the freehold, I have never been able to reach the same heights as our ancestors. Almost all important knowledge of Valyrian sorcery was wiped out completely when the 14 flames erupted. Only bits and pieces remain. She leaned forward, her face turning deadly serious once more. Just remember this, Maegor, the doom of Valyria happened for a reason. There are some ancient powers better left buried in the ash. Seeing me nod in understanding, her stern expression softened back into a small smile. When you are older and wiser, I will teach you the secrets I have managed to piece together. Then I shall wait until whatever time you deem perfect, Mother, I replied, leaning back into my oak chair and letting out a relaxed breath as I stared past her toward the narrow window. Visenya reached across the table, lacing her long fingers through mine and lifting my hand to her lips to press a gentle kiss against my knuckles. Skorirat Syrosti Trasi Eel, you have always been the perfect son, she murmured in the low, liquid tones of High Valyrian. I couldn't help stop the amused smirk from spreading across my face due to the dramatics as I pushed my chair back and stood up from the breakfast table. Sayao, Syrosti Munya, and you, the perfect mother, I replied smoothly in the same tongue, offering her a dramatic bow. With my belly full and my morning complete, I turned and began walking toward the heavy doors of the solar, bidding her a peaceful afternoon. Oh, before you go, Maegor, Visenya's voice called out from behind me, carrying an unmistakable thread of dry humor. I forgot to mention, your elder brother, following your brilliant example yesterday, walked out on his own septon lecture this morning. I paused at the threshold, shaking my head in disbelief. Aenys, you poor, impressionable idiot. King Aegon was going to be absolutely furious when he got back from his procession. Chapter 15, March my soldiers, I commanded, waving a hand over the sunbaked dirt. The group of soldiers obeyed instantly, marching forward in a ragged yet surprisingly straight line. On the opposite side of the yard, the enemy general issued a shrill, cracking command of his own, and his little army broke into a chaotic charge, screaming bloody murder as they sprinted toward my lines. TCH, a rookie mistake, but entirely expected from an inexperienced commander who probably learned his strategy from picture books rather than thousands of hours of campaign simulations on Hearts of Iron 4 and Crusaders Kings 3. The enemy vanguard lunged at my boys like a pack of starving hounds chasing a three-legged rabbit, completely lacking coordination, spacing, or basic tactical awareness. Naturally, because they were my soldiers and I had drilled them until their legs felt like lead, my center did not break. Instead, the middle portion of my formation intentionally slouched backward, sliding into a neat, sweeping crescent shape on the bloodless dirt of the Bailey. Sensing total victory within his tiny grasp, the opposing general bellowed a triumphant cheer, goading his men into a manic, foaming frenzy. They rushed headlong into the pocket. Just when it looked like my center was about to snap under the pressure, my flank units slammed shut like a steel trap. The boys at the ends pushed hard through their bewildered opponents, who were far too distracted by the illusion of breaking my center to notice the disaster unfolding behind them. I smiled a wicked, terrifying grin, curling my hand into a tight fist. Victory was securely in my pocket. I am the Melon Lord, muahahaha. Eat dirt, you little peasant brain shits. I have spent countless hours hunched over glowing monitors mastering strategy mechanics, and you expect to match my sheer, unadulterated tactical power. Please, you are playing checkers in a sandbox while I am orchestrating the fall of empires. Within seconds, the enemy forces were entirely encircled. Before they could comprehend what had happened, completely blinded by their adolescent lust for battle, my boys caught them from behind with blunt training swords, tapping them out in a brutal rearguard ambush. I win, I declared, letting out a sharp, evil laugh that echoed off the stone barracks. The annoying kid standing at the opposite end of the courtyard gritted his teeth so hard I thought his molars were going to shatter into powder. This marked his 10th consecutive loss in a row. Not a single victory against me all week. That is right, folks. I am better, I am stronger, I am smarter. Please completely ignore the slight technicality that I older than anyone on this field. No, I challenge you to single combat. Fight me like a man if you are brave enough, Prince Maegor. The boy shouted, his face bright red with adolescent rage as he raised his wooden training sword high into the air. He had enough sense to still refer to me by Prince however. By this point, the defeated enemy forces had groaned and picked themselves up from the dirt, dusting off their wool tunics and staring blankly at their furious leader. Well, calling them enemy forces was perhaps a bit too dramatic for a Tuesday afternoon scrimmage. There were only 5 boys in his ragtag army and 5 in mine. I slowly stood up from my makeshift seat. The unfortunate kid I had been using as a living chair all afternoon let out a massive, wheezing sigh of relief, his spine snapping back straight as he collapsed forward into the dirt. Maybe telling him that supporting my royal weight was great core conditioning wasn't my finest motivational coaching moment. Hey, it is not my fault that medieval children are completely gullible and easy to exploit. I accept your challenge. May the old gods and the new pick the rightful winner on this sacred battlefield. Reaching down, I picked up my blunt sword from the ground, patting my stomach over the heavily padded leather gambeson to ensure everything was snug. The angry little lordling similarly stomped toward the center of the yard until we stood face to face, the afternoon sun beating down on our sweaty brows. My liege, let me fight in your stead, a booming voice spoke up. It was Davos Baratheon. Stepping forward with a solemn bow and kneeling, I walked past him. I paused and wondered if it really was the best idea for him to call me that. It's not like anyone would care about some 5 and 10-year-olds, right? Looking back at my loyal little army, surveying the distinct expression stamped across their varied faces. There was Davos, built like an absolute brick outhouse, easily towering over most kids his age, with the tip of his wooden sword planted firmly into the dirt as he bowed his head. Standing to his immediate left was Daemon Velaryon, the future lord of Driftmark, whose silver hair clung to his sweaty forehead. To his right stood Tristan Strong, the brawny son of the Hand of the King, nodding along in fierce agreement with Davos's chivalrous offer. The fourth member of my personal vanguard, Edwell Celtigar, the future lord of House Celtigar, stepped forward with a grim, serious expression to hand me my thick leather gloves. Finally, sitting slumped against a stone pillar near the back with a totally winded expression was Stefan Darklyn, nephew of Esser Robin Darklyn. They were all strong, capable kids, and every single one of them was older than me by at least a few years. Yet somehow, through a combination of brutal physical training, tactical dominance, and sheer psychological warfare, I had earned their respect. All my previous statements about earning respect might have been a little exaggerated. All I had to do was beat them up a few times. But this was my army, and I was not about to let them down in front of a challenger. Davos, my brother, do you have absolute trust in the powers of your liege? I asked him, tucking my wooden sword securely under my armpit as I jammed my fingers into the stiff leather fighting gloves. Hesitating for a second, the young Baratheon blinked, looking up with a confused frown before responding, "Of course I do, my liege, but..." "Then say no more, Davos. Have complete trust in me." Reaching out, I took the heavy iron great helm from the hands of Edwell Celtigar, pulling it down over my head. The thick, wool-stuffed interior padding pressed snugly against my ears, designed specifically to prevent brain-rattling concussions for high-born squires during melee training. A moment passed before the Baratheon finally relented, shaking his head with a deep scowl. Yet he did not object further, merely raising his armored forearm for a crisp, synchronized dap-up. I returned the gesture without missing a beat, and we both slammed our fists together and patted each other firmly on the back like seasoned mercenaries on campaign. The exact same ceremony was repeated with Daemon, Tristan, Edwell, and Stefan, each of them offering muttered words of encouragement and loyalty before I turned my back and marched toward the challenger, who was leaning heavily on his sword and waiting for my arrival with a sneer. Who in their right mind would have ever guessed that aristocratic boys, even in a brutal medieval shithole like Westeros, desperately wanted to cosplay as legendary warriors and knights? Throw in a few structured beatings, tactical pep talks, and modern customs like the dap-up, and you can turn a bunch of spoiled noble brats into your fiercely loyal personal servants, lifelong friends. Let the gods decide the fate of our houses, the challenger sneered, raising his wooden blade. Then so it shall be, I responded smoothly, catching my grip and readying my sword as the squire opposite me mirrored my stance. With a sudden war cry that sounded more like a choked goose, the boy lunged forward, swinging his blunt sword in a wild, unpolished arc aimed directly at my collarbone. Step to the left, pivot on the heel, parry with a sharp crack. The impact rattled straight up my forearms, but I didn't even flinch. Before he could recover his balance, I stepped inside his clumsy guard and went entirely on the offensive. I channeled my inner berserker, raining down a relentless, rhythmic series of brutal overhead strikes. Bam, 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 each blow hammered down relentlessly against his iron kettle helm, sending hollow, deafening clangs echoing across the stone courtyard that made him stagger backward like a drunken sailor. He raised his sword in a pathetic attempt to block, but I swiped it aside with a savage downward hook, smashing my weapon squarely into the thick quilted padding of his gambeson. The boy gasped, the wind rushing out of his lungs in a sharp wheeze. I didn't give him a single second to recover. I pivoted on my heel and brought my sword around in a vicious horizontal swipe, catching him squarely on the hardened leather gorget guarding his throat. He stumbled hard, his boots tangling in the dirt. I followed up instantly, raining a flurry of blows down upon his stiffened queerwheelie leather breastplate, pounding away at him like a blacksmith hammering a white-hot horseshoe on an anvil. His defense completely shattered under the sheer weight of my assault. With a desperate, choked cry, his knees buckled, and he crashed hard onto his back in the dirt, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. In a fraction of a second, I closed the remaining distance, planting my heavy boot squarely beside his ribs and thrusting the blunt tip of my sword straight down until it rested flush against his throat. "Yield," I commanded, my voice cold, calm, and dripping with absolute authority. The boy stared up at the wooden point hovering over his windpipe, his chest heaving violently as sweat poured down his flushed face. He looked around the courtyard, saw his friends watching in stunned silence, and let out a defeated sigh. "I yield," he choked out, his shoulders slumping completely. To prove his absolute surrender, he took his sword and tossed it carelessly aside into the dust. The moment the weapon left his hand, I lowered my guard, letting out a triumphant sigh. But before I could even celebrate my flawless victory, my entire army of adoring teenage boys broke formation and sprinted toward me like a pack of wild wolves. "Our liege," someone screamed. Before I could brace myself, 100 pounds of teenage meat crashed into me from all sides. I went down hard, tumbling into the dirt as Davos, Demon, Tristan, Edwell, and Stefan all dogpiled directly on top of me in a chaotic, victorious pile of limbs, laughing and shouting like drunken fools. "Get off me, you heavy bitches. I am suffocating." I muffled into the dirt, struggling beneath the mountain of high-born flesh. "What the seven hells are you squires doing in the dirt?" A booming, gravelly voice echoed across the courtyard, cutting through the celebration like a battle-axe. Sir Humphrey strode into the training yard, his heavy steel plate armor clacking noisily with every heavy step he took. He paused, his weathered face twisted into a look of bewilderment as he ratcheted his head and let out a sigh. "We leave the yard for a while, and this is what the future of the realm amounts to. Rolling around in the mud like a litter of pigs." Immediately, the crushing pressure bearing down on my back vanished. Everyone scrambled off me in a blind panic. Before I could even push myself up from the dirt and wipe the dust off my face, I looked around and realized that every single one of my trusted brothers in arms had abandoned me to face the final boss alone. Those traitorous little bitches actually ran away. Cowards and cravens, every last one of them. Sir Humphrey shook his massive head, running a scarred, calloused hand through his thick gray-streaked beard in sheer exasperation. He looked down at me, his sharp eyes narrowing. "How do you manage to accomplish something like that every single time I turn my back, my prince?" I pushed myself up onto my knees, dusting off my leather gambeson with an innocent, angelic blink. "I honestly have no idea what you are talking about, Sir Humphrey. We were merely engaging in a peaceful, highly educational diplomatic seminar on regional defense strategy." That caused the veteran knight to click his teeth in annoyance, though I was certain that half of my words didn't even make sense to him, before he let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I peeked up through my silver hair, suddenly remembering a crucial administrative detail that had been bugging me all week. "Wait, it has been around a full week since you started training me every morning, sir. Does that official status mean I am finally your recognized squire?" The old knight paused, falling silent for a long moment as he hummed thoughtfully to himself, his gaze drifting over the scattered training weapons. "You are, I suppose, technically my squire now," Sir Humphrey muttered gruffly, scratching his jaw. "I have never laid eyes on another boy with even half your unnatural talent when it comes to steel, footwork, and sheer stubborn violence." He shook his head firmly to snap himself back on point. "There is not much in the way of formal ceremony that we follow to declare someone a squire in the royal household, but yes, by the old codes, you are mine. Though do not go thinking this means you will be scrubbing my mail shirts or polishing my boots like the common lads do." The knight muttered something else under his breath, his voice trailing off into an unintelligible rumble. But this time, my sharp ears managed to catch a faint, muttered reference to my mother. "W's in the chat for my mother, come on guys." Stepping up from the shadows yet again, wielding her terrifying queenly aura to ensure her favorite 5-year-old warlord didn't have to waste time doing menial peasant chores. Read up to 20 chapters ahead on my Patreon, patreon.com/dekiru77. To be continued.